going to get started with the course, the economic benefits of CF&D. And as I said, so 6 consecutive Monday nights. And tonight is the first session on emission reductions, getting to net zero, which is really cool. Hey, I want a little shout out to my co-pilots, Leah and Morgan, who are just helping with the technology tonight, as well as someone I'll introduce later. Paul Bernstein will give part of the presentation. I'm Jerry Hinkle. I've been on the research team for 3.5 years. It's me, Rick Knight, and Sarah Wanis, and I do the economics. And I'm ABD in economics, all but dissertation, and I have separately I have a master's degree in climate policy. And I've been at this for like 20 years, and I've been studying on my own the economics of climate policy for a long time. This is what we want to do tonight. I want to start with the course objectives and give you a feel for what we're doing here. And it really is about the economic argument can greatly strengthen our advocacy. Because it's just very strong. This really does make the economy better. This really does make society substantially better. We're really doing good things here. We're forwarding, we're advocating for very good policy. We'll take a look at the models that evaluate emission reductions. And we'll take a look at why sometimes you can see very different results. And finally, the key point from tonight will be that we're back in a pretty amazing policy. A lot of folks talk about this holy grail of getting to net zero by 2050. And this policy, you know, according to a very credible model, actually achieves that. So what are the course objectives? I just said the economic argument is really strong, but I want you to understand as well as you can why, so that you'll have greater confidence in your advocacy, and so possibly you can serve as an expert within your region or within your chapter when some of these questions come up. So why is the economic argument so strong? Economists almost universally support it. You've seen the slide. We'll see it again. On the right, Ben Bernanke, Ellen Greenspan, these are household names. On the left, Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary, have all supported CF&D. Why? Well, revenue neutral carbon taxes generally will clearly make the economy and society significantly better off. That's good. So GDP, jobs, our health, and inequality all improve with a policy like ours, or this revenue neutral carbon tax. What I mean by that is you charge for polluting, you return all the funds. And importantly, the information that we're going over the next 6 weeks is all from the peer-reviewed literature. This isn't our analysis. This isn't the advocate. But this is the independent experts speaking in the peer-reviewed literature. And one of the reasons that we like that is that in this conversation, as we really get down to brass tacks of designing climate policy in the US Congress, we're going to be speaking from the same script as these independent experts. And, you know, Adele Morris of Brookings is on our advisory board. Noah Kaufman was on our call in January. He was on our national call. And I love it when these things turn out, because we've been saying this for a while. And sure enough, most of you may know, but a couple weeks ago, Noah was appointed to the White House Council of Economic Advisors. So, and a lot of the analysis that we look at in this course is he's going to be a primary author on. So he's now got the ear of people like Janet Yellen and Gina McCarthy and John Kerry, as well as President Biden. And so we're going to be speaking from the same script. It's a good thing. So I want to go over with you. Here are the 6 summary points for the course, 1 per week, if you will. And we'll get into detail and get you comfortable with it. Emissions, we just said it. Our policy gets you on the path to net zero by 2050. Next week, really interesting, GDP, gross domestic product. This, for most, is the single most important measure of how the economy is doing. Okay, and what we're going to find out is that when a policy is evaluated in terms of its impact on the economy, it does not include the very substantial climate benefits and health benefits that come from the policy. Okay, even still, in the short term, GDP is roughly neutral in the short term. In the long term, clearly hugely positive with a revenue neutral carbon tax. And I'll show you a study from the IMF that shows you so clearly the policy is good for the economy. Okay, and what happens in the longer term to make that so is that climate benefits really kick in. In other words, if you don't do anything to address climate change, the economy is going to take a real hit in time, starting about 20 years. In 2 Mondays from now, we're going to go over the net policy benefits, and it's a great story. The climate and health benefits of a policy like EICDA are worth roughly $1 trillion a year net for the United States. Clearly makes the economy and society better. We'll go over jobs after that. Job opportunities grow. Fairness. It's very unique, not to a revenue neutral carbon tax, but to carbon fee and dividends, CFD, that the poor see a substantial financial benefit. Doesn't happen under regulations, doesn't happen under other revenue neutral carbon taxes. Yeah, and then finally, and this will be kind of news. This is not something we've been said clearly to this point. Go ahead and whoever's taking out their garbage, go ahead and mute them. There's clearly a productive role for regulations to play, especially those that complement a carbon tax. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. So I hope you can see from this, the story is going to be really empowering for our advocacy. This is good policy. So I'm going to start you with a study done 3 years ago now, March 2018. The Climate Change Economics Journal was devoted to a massive study on the impacts of revenue neutral carbon tax policies. They wanted to go beyond one model. So they took 11 strong peer-reviewed models in the US. They had them each run 4 carbon tax scenarios. Okay, revenue neutral carbon tax scenarios. So starting at $25 a ton and going up 1% a year, 25 plus 5% a year, $50 a ton going up at 1% a year, $50 a ton going up 5% a year. So they all 11 models ran those scenarios, and they did it doing 3 different things with the revenue. Policy like ours, CF&D, funds going back to the household, cut labor taxes, or use the funds to cut business taxes. So if you want to count that up, that's 12 times 11. That's 132 different results, and we'll see that clearly next week. It's really pretty amazing. 15 different articles came of this. Very comprehensive study. For folks like us that want to get to know better the impact of a revenue neutral carbon tax on the economy and elsewhere, this is really powerful stuff. It was actually co-chaired. It was out of Stanford and Brookings, and the effort was co-chaired by Adele Morse, who's on our advisory committee. So here we go. This is one of their summary slides on emission reductions. And I've got my little red pointer here. I'm going to walk you through it. So here's the level of US emissions. And we're going to go here for 15 years, from 2015 to 2030. Okay, here's the level of emissions. Here's where we're starting out. These red lines are the average of the 11 models, and each of the blue lines represents one of the models. This is just the reference scenario. This is what we think emissions will do in the US if we don't have a carbon tax policy. And here we run through the 4 scenarios. In this case, in each instance, the funds comes back to household. So this is a carbon fee and dividend. Okay, 25 plus 1% a year, 25, 5, 50 plus 1, 50 plus 50. And I want to concentrate on this scenario. And the reason is that it shows in very stark fashion how much the very good model estimates can differ. So this bottom run here is from the Brookings model, which shows the strongest emission reductions, and it was unable to generate a result. The model blew up, as we like to say, in this scenario. It was too much. So this scenario shows it best. But what you see here is one model showing initially, they all show initially steep reductions, but for a couple of models, they've really flattened out quickly. What's going on here? And one of the models that maybe I think at the top here is a model called NEMS. And that's kind of important to us because when Noah Kaufman did what we call the Columbia Report, evaluating EICDA a couple of years ago, he used a variation on the NEMS model. So they actually show less emission reductions than darn near anybody. And we'll see a little bit about why. Down here are models like, this is Brookings, and I think RFF is here. So they show much greater. Specifically, roughly relative to the reference scenario, after 15 years, the lowest emission reductions come out to about 20% over 15 years. Not nothing, but not much. Quells the concerns of folks that say, we don't even know if a carbon tax will work. We don't know if it'll be effective. No, it will be. But then all the way here, closer to 50% emission reductions after 15 years. So let's see if we can find out a little bit more. By the way, almost everything I'm telling you is in the white paper, which is on the community page that has you, I mean, you can get it in a number of places, but access that if you've got further questions, start there. All of this is there, and all with links to the underlying peer-reviewed literature. Okay. So to do this, to look at what the source of variation might be, let's take a look at what the source of emissions are in the US. And this is the EPA's greenhouse gas inventory by source, by sector from 2018. Okay, let's start here. Electricity, the power sector. Okay, little over a quarter of the emissions. Very important sector. Because we hope that we can electrify different sectors, right? Like transportation, like industry, but starts out only 27% of emissions. Transportation is the biggest at 28, industry 22. So these two between them are half of US emissions. Then you got commercial and residential buildings, that's 12%. So that's 62%. Ag, we're not going to deal with in this course. So that's a little bit of the lay of the land. Where are you going to get your emission reductions from? So here is a slide that I love. Hopefully you can learn to appreciate it. Same study, and we're breaking the emission reductions down by sector. Okay, let's start down the y-axis here. You've got the 4 revenue neutral carbon tax scenarios. They get more stringent as you go. We're down to 50 plus 5% a year here. And across the top, you get the names of the various models. So just to point a couple out. So G cubed is Brookings. GH stands for Golder Halfstead. That's the RFF model. And then you've got NEMS here. Oh, and so one other quick side note, New Era is kind of an interesting model. Paul Bernstein, who's going to talk in a minute, PhD from Stanford, and helped build New Era, I think. And I think he worked on that with Noah Kaufman. So Paul and Noah worked at the same time, I believe, at New Era, also known as NERA. So anyway, there's 4 kind of noteworthy models. Let's see what we've got here. This is by sector. I want to start with these blue lines that always come down the furthest in every one of the models. And that represents in the various, as a result of the various carbon taxes, the reductions, it's proportionate in the electricity or power sector. So what we see clearly is every model expects to see significant emission reductions in the electric sector. There's just an ease of substitution there. For example, one of the things we begin to see, switching out natural gas for coal. And as you start to charge for pollution, that's going to ramp up reasonably quickly. So we see a lot of emissions coming out of the power sector somewhat quickly. You see here with this model, maybe 75% of emissions out of that sector in, now this is going to be 25 years, okay, 2015 to 2040. So 75%, probably 85%, 90%, close to 100%, a lot of emission reductions consistently in that sector. What about elsewhere? What about transportation, which is 28% of emissions? Or this household and industry. This is basically buildings and industry. This is that, 22% plus 12%. Okay, so between these two, we're talking about a lot more emissions than the power sector. We're talking about 62% of US emissions currently. Let's look at NEMS on one extreme. Pretty surprising result. Okay, what we're saying here, that's both the orange and the red line. So that's 62% of US emissions. Okay, and it's not going anywhere. So this is over a 25-year period. And at 50 plus 5% a year over that 25 years, the carbon tax is actually getting up to $170 a ton. That's a stiff carbon price. EICDA is higher, right? In 25 years, it would get to $255 a ton. So it's even more stringent, but you're not seeing anything here. And as a result, the green is the total emission reductions as a proportion again. And it comes down hard as emissions are reduced in the energy sector, right? Because here's the blue for the energy sector. And it kind of flattens out and it doesn't go anywhere. So that's interesting. And again, NEMS is kind of an important model. It's used by a lot of folks, but doesn't show great emission reductions. Let's just take this model, US REP REDS. So REDS was a model used by REMI in the old analysis that we did. Strong emission reductions here, but you can see transportation, there's at least, you're getting 15% reductions at least. Household and industry, 25% or so. There's a lot more going on there. And that's pretty consistent with the rest of the models. So here's what I want to give you a feel for. Two different worlds, overall 20% emission reductions, 50%. What's going on in the two? I can make up a story for NEMS. I can make up a story for how this model is being derived. You're looking historically, you're deriving historic data from the past, okay? And you're seeing periods where energy prices are going up and down, and you're looking at the relationship between that and what happens to emissions in transportation. When gas prices go up, when they go down, are people jumping to EVs, to more efficient cars, to carpooling? Apparently, this data says no, not so much. But I want to suggest to you that there's an alternative view of our future under a strong commitment to charging for pollution, like EICDA, like a 50+5. It's not just a matter of gas prices went up and you don't know how long it will stick. You don't know how long it will be for, and what is the next move there. They're going to go up. Over 25 years, you're up to about $1.60 a gallon gas tax. Policy like ours, more like $2.30. You're going to begin making decisions today to reduce your carbon footprint, and other things are going to be going on. It's going to be all over the press. There will be other policies put into place that encourage people to reduce their emissions. There will be much said about the need to address climate change and to go clean energy as a result. So it's really hard for me to imagine something like this being accurate. I've had this conversation with Noah. It was uncomfortable, but we're still friends. So I'm voting here. You got this really non-aggressive profile, if you will, where you get minimal reductions. I think if you really put on what I'll call a transformative carbon tax policy, especially if it's passed with broad support so that folks know it's not going anywhere at the next election cycle, you're going to get a movement in the country that's far more consistent with these strong emission reductions. So that's my view. That's my take. You know, we're not going to get nothing out of this 62% of U.S. emissions. So that's a key source. And at this point, I want to turn it over to Paul Bernstein. I think I introduced him, but again, Stanford PhD, had a career in building these models in part, worked to help build one of the models. And I want Paul to come on to give you, spend a few minutes, give you maybe a more in-depth view of why there can be such variation in the model results. Paul, take it away.
Well, thanks, Rick, for the introduction.
I'm Jerry. I mean,
Jerry,
people do confuse us. It's okay.
I do.
Go ahead, buddy.
I got introduced to you folks at the same time, and I still confuse it. Sorry.
Okay.
And even the name's right there, and I can't even read. So anyway, but that should give you confidence, folks, that I just deal in numbers. I'm not very good with letters. So anyways, so as Jerry said, I did work at NERA for a number of years and worked on the New Era model. So have some insight and also participated in previous energy modeling forum, these model comparison exercise, which this is one of them. In terms of more detail as to why the model results differ, I want to focus on three different things. One is the underlying database on which the models are built. So these models are predominantly what we call computable general equilibrium models. And they are built upon, generally referred to as input-output matrix, or really social accounting matrices. But what these matrices do is they lay out the production, how goods and services are being produced and how goods and services are being consumed. So they define how much energy, materials, capital, and labor go into production processes and how much of these goods and services and energy consumers consume. So right off the bat, if you have a different database, you have a different ability in which you can substitute among the different inputs in production, or that households will substitute when they see price changes. The second thing that matters is you start from a database which is a snapshot in time. So if you look at these models, they're using a database generally in probably the 2011 to 2015 timeframe, because these databases aren't necessarily created every year. And you take that database and now you have to project it forward in time. And you first start with a baseline that you try to tie to a third-party forecast, because as a modeler, you're trying to be somewhat agnostic in terms of the baseline, and what matters to you is looking at scenarios that are a change from the baseline and comparing the economic impacts, whether that be change in carbon emissions, GDP, welfare, what have you. And so what matters when we're looking at carbon prices, or one of the things that matters when we're looking at carbon prices, is what energy prices are the models tying themselves to. So why this is so important is that when we're looking at a carbon price scenario where we're putting on a carbon tax, that one of the main drivers in how people respond, how businesses respond, how people respond, is what's referred to as an elasticity of substitution. So simply what that is saying is, what is the percentage change in quantity of something divided by the percentage change in price? And to put this in, to think about it in more common terms, we can think about goods such as cigarettes, which are viewed as highly inelastic, meaning that you can have very high taxes on the good, but you don't get a great response. And we see something like that. Sometimes people talk about gasoline being somewhat inelastic, not nearly as inelastic as cigarettes, but somewhat um, inelastic, meaning that we see an increase in the price of gasoline, let's say a 10% increase in the price of gasoline, but we only see a 1 to 2% change in the quantity of gasoline consumed in kind of in the near term. So if you think about this, that remember what we're looking at the percentage change in quantity. So we can think about that as change in emissions to the percentage change in price. So the percentage change in energy prices. So if I'm running two different models and I'm giving them the same carbon price change, say it's $50 a ton, but I'm starting with much different baseline energy prices, I'm going to get a much larger percentage change in price, which is going to lead to a larger change in the quantity of the good. In other words, a greater drop in emissions. So unfortunately, I'll say that these models neither use the same database nor are exactly tied to the same baseline. So right off the bat, you would expect, even if the models were identical in every other facet, that you're going to get different results. The next thing, which Jerry has done a good job describing, and really probably more at the heart of what we can glean from here, is the difference in the representation of technologies. And the key sector here is actually the electric sector. So all these models, as Jerry showed in a previous slide, you saw the lion's share of the reductions in the electric sector. That's where everybody believes, and what we see today, where emissions are easiest to be reduced. And we do see this, right? We've seen a massive change from coal-fired generation to natural gas-fired generation as gas prices have dropped relative to coal prices. So this is also an argument of why carbon prices would work, right? That prices really do matter. As much as President Trump wanted to bring back coal, he was unable to do it. Had little to do with environmental regulations and had much more to do with the economics of the situation. Continuing on in the other sectors, as well as the electric sector, is what the models assume for breakthrough technologies. So there's one model that showed, I believe, about 100% reduction in emissions from the electric sector. And that's because it has a much more optimistic view of carbon capture and sequestration. The other thing that matters is the cost of new technologies. And specifically in the electric sector, think of fossil fuel generation versus non-fossil generation. And I'm sorry, Jerry, I can't remember all your other slides, but if people go to the report, or we can make it available, from which you got those figures, you can see that some of the models actually show an increase in the consumption of natural gas over time for some of the policies that don't have the highest level of carbon price. And this is because in those models, what's happening is coal is getting crushed, but natural gas, the difference in cost between natural gas and the renewable technologies, natural gas is not necessarily uncompetitive with the non-fossil generation sources. So as carbon prices go up, those models move from coal to gas and not as much to renewables, where other models are different. Other models, you're seeing a drop in gas and much greater shift to renewables. Next, the elasticities, which I described, the greater the value you put on elasticities of substitution. So you could take a production process that takes, let's say, electricity, materials, labor, capital, and then fossil fuels to make its good. The more elastic, or in other words, the easier it is to substitute among all those first category of goods versus fossil fuels, the more a carbon price will do to decarbonize that sector. So the models differ in that, and we see a difference. And last, just comparing two models, for example, if you look at the $50 and 1% scenario, the DIEM and the New Era model, I think, are very similar. They're built upon basically the same database. They do have a slightly different baseline, but the model structures are very similar, yet you see this difference in the drop of emissions by 2040 of 45% in the DIEM and 30% in the New Era. And that's probably going back to a large extent with the difference in assumptions about elasticities and the assumptions about new technologies. So I'll stop there, Jerry.
Thanks, Paul. And Paul, will be available for questions. And at the end of the day, any questions on this, feel free to write me at Jerry, Jerry, at Citizens Climate Lobby. And if there are questions that you need to go to Paul, then I will forward them. But we should have 10 or 15 minutes at the end of this to go through this. Saw some stuff in the chat. Yeah, I was assuming a 25-year period for a tax of $50 plus 5%. So at the end of that 25 years, it would be a $169 tax. Okay, so there we go. So I just wanted to show this briefly. We've only got a couple of explicit estimates of our policy. Here's one, and I've got and it's the RFF carbon pricing calculator. Many of you have seen it. It's linked in the white paper for the course, and it shows an interesting profile. There continues to be smooth emission reductions over time, over 15 years. So this is not one that kinks up and stops, which makes a world of sense to me. People continue to adapt to a higher and higher and higher price. Our price is even higher than any of those shown to this point. So 37% emissions reductions relative to the reference scenario by 2030 after 10 years here, and then 44% thereafter. So now I want to spend 5 or 10 minutes on this paper. Noah talked about it briefly on our January call. I talked about it at the national conference presentation. It's important for a couple of reasons. Key to it is what he's saying here is what we've long done is try to find the ideal carbon price, okay? And to do that, to find the ideal optimal carbon price, you have to be able to estimate with reasonable accuracy what the damages are of emissions today, even though those damages will be incurred over decades and decades and even beyond, right? That's really difficult. There's so much uncertainty there that aren't you better off, is what Noah's saying in this paper. And this came out just in November. Aren't you better off? Let's have policymakers give us the objective. Tell us how fast you want to reduce emissions and to what level. And then one thing that we are good at is telling you the carbon price that is likely to get you there. So that's his near term to net zero alternative. The social cost of carbon is something we'll talk about in week 3 of this course. Interesting discussion, but this is an alternative to that then. And you may have seen this. But here are the three objectives that the paper lays out. Emission reductions consistent with net zero by 2040, by 2050, and by 2060, okay? So obviously, as the date for getting to net zero goes out, the carbon price required is going to fall. And that's what we see here. The green is the 2060, blue, 2050, whatever that color that is. Red, orange is 2040. And of course, one of the things that is really valuable to us in our advocacy is in taking a look at what price is required to get to this objective that is so commonly adopted now by Biden, by the Democrats generally, and some Republicans, is net zero in the US by 2050. And this comes from the IPCC, which says we can avoid the worst damages of climate change if globally we hit net zero by 2050. Okay, so what this analysis says is in 2025, you need a carbon price. Look at, we're a bit uncertain, but somewhere between $34 and $64 a ton, okay? And the average, the median, I think it is $52 a ton, okay? By 2030, you need a rapidly increasing carbon price such that it's 72 to, I think 132 is the range here. And you need a price of just over $100 a ton. And sure enough, our policy, if the price were to start today at $15 a ton and you had $10 a year, we're at $55 a ton right there in 2025, and we're at $105 a ton right there in 2030. And they very much address the question, well, what about after that? And they say, you can see the uncertainty as depicted by these bars. He says, let's stop and take a deep breath after 10 years. See how effective the carbon price that we had was in reducing emissions before we determine, or so that we can determine the price necessary going forward, right? If emission reductions weren't what we expected them to be, we need a higher price going forward. If they are stronger than expected, then maybe the price increase does not need to be as much. But the bottom line for us, wow, we nailed it. Our policy puts you squarely on the path to achieve this, this critically important objective. If we can achieve net zero by 2050, we can help really do our part to stabilize climate risk. And what a wonderful day that would be. Now, and Paul alluded to some of this, but NOAA in the paper has come out and quantified what are the key sources of uncertainty. You saw by the bars that we weren't sure now what that price needed to be. Well, what are the sources of uncertainty? So let me run over a couple of key examples with you. The first one is, as Paul had mentioned, fossil fuel prices going forward. We've got to assume some trajectory for fossil fuel prices. This is important. Why? Because if they're low, then people, as they have been, are attracted to the consumption of fossil fuels. They, gas prices drop, they go out and buy the trucks, right? Trucks become very popular. This is the kind of thing that happens, okay? Well, according to this analysis, if oil prices are lower than expected in my model, so I've got some assumption. What if they're lower than that? Well, then my carbon price, the black is in the year 2030, okay? The carbon price, instead of being 100, is going to have to be $28 a ton higher if oil prices are much less than expected. So I hope you can see what's happening here. If oil prices, without the carbon fee, are higher than expected, that's great for us. If OPEC, buckles down and reduces production significantly, raising prices greatly, then they're doing part of our job for us. That makes sense. And the carbon price can be significantly lower. But you see the source of uncertainty in the model. We've got to assume something on fossil fuel prices, and being right matters. And this quantifies that, which is really great. By the way, exactly what is behind each of these high and low scenarios is spelled out in the supplemental material in the paper. It's all listed there. So if you want to dig further, the link is in the paper and you can get to the supplemental material. Innovation is key because innovation is a complete wild card. Here's what innovation is saying. Look, solar prices have come way down. Wind prices have come way down. What's going to happen going forward? We've got to assume something. And part of this is a function of how much money is going into low carbon technologies, okay? But innovation is key, and we really don't know what's going to happen. We're going to assume something. But as you can see here, if there's low innovation, if wind and solar prices don't come down as quickly as we expect them to, we're going to need a higher carbon price as a result. In contrast, if it's better than expected, if these things really start coming down, then we don't need as high a carbon price, significantly lower. And one thing to note here, a carbon price makes low carbon technologies far more profitable. You've got a carbon price. Next thing you know, it's profitable to reduce emissions. It makes you money. It saves you money. So now, yes, the government will come in with R&D funding for low carbon innovation, research and development, but the private sector is going to jump in because there's money to be made. Adele Morse once said to me that the two most important impacts from your policy is one, what it has on the rest of global emissions, and two, the impact on innovation, because it will make R&D, private sector R&D profitable, and it'll increase it significantly. The other thing I want to underline that's important here is this issue of complementary policies. How does NOAA get to net zero by 2050? He's got a little bit of help, not a lot. What I mean by that is, as I spoke about when we looked at the different models, he's assuming here that this is somewhat of a brave new world, that the country's got a little bit of emission reduction fever, and that the carbon price will not be alone in reducing emissions. There will be complementary policies that assist, specifically air pollution regulations that lead to quicker closures of coal plants in particular, government money for R&D for low carbon technologies, and energy efficiency standards in appliances, in buildings, etc. So those are going to be strengthened a little bit in the base case here. They're not going to be what they are today. And that helps them. That doesn't help a lot. We'll talk about this in week 6. We'll talk about complementary policies. And if you read that section of the white paper, there's a couple of great articles on it, done by Noah Kaufman, as it turns out. Okay, so key sources of uncertainty. But what does it mean for our advocacy? I want to kind of underline something before I wrap up and go to questions. There are many that discuss this objective or embrace this objective of net zero by 2050. Some, but just embracing the objective is one thing. Having a plan to get there is another. But there are some plans that get there. For example, in all due respect, love the work these folks are doing, but the Clean Futures Act was just introduced into Congress. Okay, so that's a plan, but it doesn't tell you what the costs of this climate policy are or who's going to pay for them. We've got a plan that is soup to nuts, legislative language, and in so spelling out exactly how we're going to do that, analysis will tell you there are trade-offs here. There will be winners, there will be losers. Polluting industries, will be disadvantaged as a result of our legislation, but it's all spelled out. If you will, we've taken the bull by the horns. So we've got a plan, the costs are addressed, there's legislative action. What you're advocating for is a live, fully fleshed out plan that gets us on the way to net zero. And I think we can all be proud of that. Jerry Hinkle, just a little quick context for the course. Once again, probably many of you were on last week, and this will be a brief repeat. But so what we're fundamentally doing here is the economic argument for generally our policy, EICDA, but revenue neutral carbon tax is generally carbon pricing as a policy to address climate change. The economic arguments are really strong. Truly, it's good for the economy, truly good for society. The better I can arm you with this argument, and we'll do it in the peer-reviewed literature, not based on our internal analysis that we sponsored, but what's in the sort of generally agreed stuff out there in the peer-reviewed literature. The more credible, the stronger the advocate you'll be. That's what we're doing here. So impact on GDP, good for the economy. GDP is really the single most recognized. All right, now I got to figure out how to forward my screen. This is getting a little irritating. Just have to hit it harder. It's the single most identifiable measure of the health of the economy. Yeah, but how's GDP doing? What's the impact on GDP? So this is important. I'm not going to introduce myself again. I'm Jerry Hinkle. I'm a research coordinator along with Rick Knight and Sarah Wanis. Here's what we're going to do tonight. 3 main points. I'm just going to dump that. So there's much, increasingly common analysis of the impact of various climate policies, carbon tax policies, revenue neutral carbon tax policies on the economy, on GDP. And normally when they do this, they evaluate separately the impact on GDP and the key benefits of the policy. The climate benefits, we get to stabilize climate risk, and the health benefits, which are just tremendous. And so it's just important to know that, because sometimes you'll look at a measure of GDP and say, just how good is it for us? Well, it's real good. Anyway, when you include the climate and health benefits impact of a revenue neutral carbon tax on GDP, the impact on GDP is positive in the short term and very, very positive in the long term. And the reason is, in the longer term, it takes time for the health or for the climate benefits. Climate benefits are, good now, but they're much stronger in the decades ahead. So the third thing, revenue neutral carbon tax, clearly good for the economy. What we'll see is that not addressing climate change would be devastating for the economy. We're going to look at the measures of the GDP impact of revenue neutral carbon tax that don't include any policy benefits. Then we're going to look at what the climate and health benefits are, just the economic element of those. And then we're going to look at sort of the finale, if you will, GDP impacts of this type of policy when you include the benefits, and then we'll summarize and take questions. This is something you may be familiar with. I've certainly showed it before. It's from Dr. Noah Kaufman, right, who's now on the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He testified before the Energy and Commerce Committee at the end of 2019. Okay, and here's essentially what he showed them. Now, this is a GDP analysis without including any of the benefits. This was based on a 2018 analysis. This was GDP at the time, 18,620. The model projects GDP in 10 years time, okay, without any carbon tax. This is current policy, no carbon tax, 27,653. Okay, then he's going to run the model through 5 different revenue neutral carbon tax scenarios. The first 3 are what we call a payroll swap, where all of the funds come back and are used to reduce taxes on labor via a payroll tax reduction. Okay, the next one, this second from the right, is essentially CF&D. It's $50 a ton, equal rebates going back to households. Then he's got one that in which the money is used to pay down the deficit. And his summary point is to kind of look back and say, look at that, look at the visual. What impact do these policies have on GDP, on the health of the economy? Not much. His quote. And so I show this in presentations. It's a great summary slide. It's reflective of the literature. Some studies suggest roughly 0 impacts on the overall growth of the US economy. And again, why this is so powerful for us is the GDP impact is kind of the cost. If there's not much of a cost, then you get all the benefits for free. This is a huge free lunch, and we'll look at the benefits in a minute. So it's a very good news story. Now, I want to point something else. I want to look a little bit closer. In the no policy scenario, 27653, in his analysis here, the payroll taxes cause GDP to rise. So it's actually a benefit. GDP goes up. However, CF&D, which is common, will make GDP drop a little bit. By over 10 years' time, it will drop $98 billion. In this model, it stays there. You go out 20 years, it's still roughly $100 billion less GDP for having invoked the or having implemented the CF&D policy. One of the questions that we get, or what you'll hear out there, especially from more conservative types, it'll wreck the economy. And we tell them, according to the peer review analysis, it doesn't wreck the economy. It's not a job killer. It doesn't wreck the economy. We'll address climate change. This is a good thing. Okay, now here's our EMF 32 slide. Okay, and once again, it's GDP impact, no policy benefits. And I'll go a little slower for you folks that did not see this last week. It was a different slide last week. This is a massive comprehensive study on revenue neutral carbon taxes impact on the economy. We've got 11 different peer-reviewed models, okay, 11 different rows here, okay, each one of them running 4 different carbon tax scenarios. One that starts at 25 and goes up 1% a year, 25.5, starts at 50, up 1, and 50, up 5, okay? And what this is looking at is, here's what we expect GDP to be. The X is going to be the reference scenario. Okay, I'll go here. I'll show you here because it's easier for me to see. And then in each of the rows thereafter, there's actually going to be 3 results. Okay, you go down here. The square is going to be the CFD policy, where all the money goes back to household rebates. The circle is where all the money goes back to the payroll tax swap. Money goes back to reduce taxes on labor. And the triangle, the money goes back to reduce taxes on capital gains, that kind of thing. Okay, so I want to just look generally, just sort of lay back here. And if you've got the X, okay, and if these symbols are just to the left of that X, that means that GDP growth is slightly lower, okay? And as you look down the rows, you'll see most often there's just not a lot of impact, okay? There's just not a lot of impact on GDP as a result of these policies. But I want to take a little bit closer look at 4 different results. Okay, the first one is DM here. This is the DM model. And what's a little unusual here is that the green triangles are to the right of the X, which means if I were teaching in class, normally I'd ask you questions to make sure you stay awake. But I'm not even able to read chat right now, it gets in the way of my screen. So what that means is that in the estimation of this policy, the revenue neutral carbon tax, when the funds go back to reduce taxes on capital, it actually increases GDP. Okay, I'm going to go down here to the iGEM model. And once again, pretty clearly, the red circles are to the right of the reference scenario. So in this case, like the last model we saw from NOAA, the payroll tax swap causes GDP to actually increase. In all the other scenarios, it's really pretty much just a slight reduction to GDP growth. But it's a reduction. I want to point out 2 noteworthy models, if you will, where they seem to have a little stronger impact and a negative impact on GDP. First one is G cubed. You may remember from last week. That's the model out of Brookings. Shows very strong emission reductions. And we'll take a look at it later. That's why I wanted to point it out, but kind of rough. So specifically, the area between the 2 very light bars coming down, this is a bar, this is about a bar, that's 0.1% of GDP from the growth rate. That's pretty substantial. That's almost what you've got here. Same thing with RFF, the GHE3 model, that's Golder-Hafstad, that's the RFF model. So they also, in the really stringent scenarios, the high carbon tax, pretty significant decline in GDP, but they're kind of alone. Most of them are more like this, you know, not too bad. In fact, I calculated the average. It's roughly a reduction for CFD of about 0.05% of the growth rate, or about $10 billion a year. Now, I saw Michael come on, so he's going to keep me honest here, but that's a reduction to the growth rate. So it's not insignificant. So in other words, it's 10 billion this year, 20 billion next. After 10 years, it'll be in the neighborhood of $100 billion. In other words, because of the policy, GDP is about $100 billion less, similar to the model that we just saw. So that's what we've got. Let's see. Anything else? Pretty amazing, 132 results. The purpose of this was there was much discussion coming about of carbon taxes and carbon tax policy. Yeah, but that's just one model result. Yeah, but that's just one model result. What Adele Morris, who co-chaired this effort, she's on our advisory board, wanted to do was say, no, well, let's get a number of the best models that we can, and let's see if there's a very similar message through them. And she very much found that there was, or they found very much that there was. Let's see. That's it. Let me keep going here. All right. If any of you are over 60, you don't need to be Rick. You can't enter in this. The first question from this slide is, what is Ricky telling Lucy in this episode, in this scene? He says, Lucy,
you got some splaining to do.
You got some splaining to do. Who is that? Who gets the extra credit?
Hey.
Tom, excellent. You got some splaining to do, Lucy. I love that show. So wait a minute. You're showing me the GDP declines. What gives? Why would all these economists who clearly care about GDP support a revenue neutral carbon tax? And we really see outstanding support. Does GDP actually decline? Do we expect that? No, absolutely not. And what the rub is that we need to bring in the climate and health benefits from the policy. Look, the impact to GDP is the cost of the policy. And sometimes there's not a cost. Sometimes GDP grows. The benefits are the reason that we're doing this, because we're putting a price on pollution you reduce that pollution, you stabilize climate risk, you greatly improve our health. So that's important to know. Let me address first though, why might GDP decline? Here's what's going on. You put a price on carbon and you're causing firms to really substitute dirtier but more or less expensive sources of energy for cleaner but more expensive sources of energy. By more expensive, it may be that once you get the wind turbine up, it's cheaper than coal, but you've got to undertake the investment. So on an all-in basis, it's probably more, what they're shifting to is probably more expensive. And we know that because if it was cheaper, then they probably would have just gone ahead and done it. I know there's some sunk investment there. But now we're going to first take a look at what these policy benefits are, and we're going to see that they've got both economic and non-economic components to them. And then we're going to try to add those to GDP and see what happens. So I'm going to start with health co-benefits. Notice I moved the distance. Oh, that's funny. All right, I got it now. I won't have that problem anymore. So we call this a health co-benefit. The reason is we put a price on carbon to reduce to stabilize climate risk, but it dramatically reduces air pollution. And we've got a study, it's being peer reviewed now, but the author, Drew Shindell from Duke, who presented this to Congress last August, assures me that all the methodologies are based on peer reviewed work. He did a study on a policy that has very similar emission reduction characteristics as EICDA. Specifically, if it were to be applied to globally, it'd get you to 2C. We believe that our policy, our analysis shows gets you to about 1.8C. So the numbers should be even better. In other words, our emission reductions are going to be even better than this. But here's what happens. Here's what's going on in terms of health co-benefits. We avoid 90,000 premature deaths a year on average over 50 years. Wow. Going to start out slow, but then really pick up as emission reductions pick up. It's going to avoid 70,000 hospitalizations. We're going to avoid the loss of 6 million adult lost workdays a year. These are pretty tremendous benefits. Dr. Shindell values these at $700 billion a year. Think of that when you think about the potential economic cost of the CF&D policy or some of the other revenue neutral carbon tax. So this just blows them away. But how much of this is economic versus non-economic? Some of it's economic. So let me give you a key example. If someone dies, that's horrible. And there's economic analysis compiled by the EPA that shows it's in the millions of dollars for a single death. So it's really quite valuable to save a life, if you will. But what's the impact to GDP of that? Well, if the person died, you'd have lost their wages, in year 1 and year 2 for the rest of their life. Okay, that's the economic impact. It may be in the ballpark. I've seen one estimate by the World Bank of about 10% of total benefits. Still a lot, but nowhere near the value. So this policy, really good for society, good for the economy as well, but really good for society. So here's what the IMF said about it. I'm going to show you an IMF study, and they're going to work with this. And here's what they say about it. Existing valuations indicate many countries would experience substantial economic gains from these health co-benefits. So there are economic gains. Okay. Now I want to get into climate benefits. And I want to show you this report from the IMF. And it's worth noting, it came as part of the most recent World Economic Outlook. That was October 2020. This report's a big deal. Okay. Twice a year, I'm pretty sure, the IMF comes out and gives an assessment of the world economy. They update GDP, expected growth rates, etc. And in this issue, they had a really fabulous chapter on mitigating climate change and what impact that would have on GDP. And I like this statement. It's worth repeating. This is where the IMF is at, putting the global economy on, okay, addressing climate change will put the global economy on a stronger and more stable footing over the medium term. Excuse me. Addressing climate change is good for the economy. I wanted to use this study for another reason as well. Jerry can go out and do a survey of the literature and present it to you, but you know, how credible is that? I may be cherry picking. I kind of work for CCL. It's really nice, and we've seen this a couple times, when an organization like the IMF goes out and does a survey of the literature, and then they give you their results. And they should be an unbiased partisan here, and a very intelligent one. They employ a whole lot of economists. And I think that's the case here. So it's really nice to be able to rely on the IMF work. So here's what I think is a pretty stunning graph. They've done a survey of the literature to show how, if not mitigated, climate change will impact global GDP over the longer term. And sort of for an example, they show two model results. The first one here in red is from Nordhaus. Yes, he won the Nobel Prize. And GDP clearly has an impact, and it ends up at the end of the century being about 7% of global GDP. And that's a lot. That's a significant number. But so someone commented when I showed some work from at the national conference in December that, yeah, but doesn't Nordhaus really diminish the impact from climate change relative to most models? And certainly with respect to recent models, in fact, what he's got here is a carbon price. He says the optimal carbon price would yield an increase in global temperatures by the end of the century of 3.5 degrees centigrade. Okay, so that's this model here. So in other words, climate damages aren't that bad. And so the carbon price doesn't need to be that high, and you can tolerate. The optimum would be, because if the price is too high, you're detracting from the fossil fuel economy too much. So to get it just right, you're going to end up with a temperature rise of 3.5 degrees centigrade. Well, I used to live in California. That sounds crazy to me. I think most of us would agree. That's a little different. The IMF agrees, and I'll show you that next. Here's another far more recent study based on the more recent science. Most of the science for Nordhaus is 2009 and before. This is more recent. It uses a more sophisticated methodology, and the number's pretty striking. It takes a little while for climate benefits to come to roost, but when it does, boy, it is the assessment of this model, and this is the sort of mean, if you will, here, that climate change will subtract 25% of GDP from the global economy by the end of the century. That's huge. That's a lot. In other words, you can't put on a carbon tax, it'll wreck the economy. No, if you don't address climate change, according to the peer-reviewed literature, that will wreck the economy. Okay. I want to show you, this is the quote from the IMF report. So this is what they say comparing the two models. The more recent studies, for example, Burke, Singh, and Miguel, and that's the blue, okay, point to much larger damages than previously estimated and are more in line with the substantial risks scientists have warned about. However, even these estimates, this is important, note this, even these estimates are likely to understate benefits from mitigating climate change, as they imperfectly take account of or do not incorporate at all some of the damages related to temperature increases, such as a higher frequency and severity of natural disasters, where are we seeing those, a rise in sea levels, and the risk of more catastrophic climate change, like tipping points and such. So let's go back here. So where does the IMF come out on this? What do they think the damages from climate change might be to GDP over time. They might be a little bit south of even the Berksing-Miguel analysis, okay? If you don't address climate change, you will clobber the economy. Okay. And when that quote is reinforced by other noteworthy authors, I want to point that out as well. This is a report from the G30, a commission that was chaired at the time by Janet Yellen, right, our own Treasury Secretary. Mark Carney was the head of the Bank of England. Okay, and so they did this study called How Do We Get to Net Zero, basically. And here's the quote that they say. So they reiterate this overall world gross domestic product could be up to 25% lower by 2100 due to climate impacts. So again, I think it's just worth, this is not, this is an analysis that is out there that is getting some traction, if you will. All right, here's the sort of finale of the evening. This is from the IMF report. And what they've done here is they're trying to do something that the EMF work and NOAA's work didn't do. It's from a different type of model. It's called an integrative assessment model. It can integrate into the economic impacts, the environmental impacts, okay? And what they've done here, they're essentially comparing two scenarios, one in which climate change is not addressed, and another in which what is essentially a global CFD policy is put on. There's a little bit of description here, but it's a little different in that one, it's got some green infrastructure spending. It's also got some subsidies for renewables, and I believe some, yeah, there's some R&D spending as well, okay? That's a relatively small part. Most all of the rest of the revenues go back to households, as in CF&D, okay? And this policy is targeted to reduce global emissions 80% by 2050. So fairly rigorous, not too far from EICDA. That's a little stronger, but for the US only. And here's what happens, okay? So here's the USA. You can look at world next, but here's the USA, and they've got the comparison of GDP for a 3-year period, 3 different 3-year periods, if you will. 2021 to 23, 36 to 38, and 50 to 52. And what I want you to notice is when you include only the economic portion of the climate and health benefits, that's what's going on here. The avoided damages, the climate, and they're small up to 2050. They're not that big. They're like 5% of GDP, even in the Berksing model. And the co-benefit, just the economic, that small economic portion of the co-benefit, you're still getting a positive impact to GDP. These black squares are above the line. It's positively impacting GDP. That's in the shorter term. In the longer term, I think I'll just go back to this graph. Okay, shorter term to 2050, impact to GDP, gosh, maybe 5-6% of global GDP. Longer term, what, 25%. Okay, so that's going to show up in the analysis here. This right-hand side is the longer term. We're looking at the difference in the two scenarios, no policy versus this climate change the CF&D type policy. The difference for the US for GDP at 2100 is about 15-16%. GDP is dramatically higher when we've put on a policy to significantly reduce emissions. It's higher in the US, it's higher in the world. This is good for GDP clearly in the shorter term and in the longer term. And to make that clear, you've got to include the benefits of the policy, but nothing wrong with that. And once again, and will be our topic for next week. the benefits are far more than those which impact the economy. What we'll find next week is that net benefits from a policy like EICDA hit about $1 trillion a year after 10 years. Initially, you don't get much emission reduction. After 10 years, it's more significant. Net benefits about $1 trillion a year. Really good for the economy, good for society. Let's see. So that is key. GDP grows when you include the benefits in the short term and very much in the long term. I wanted to show you one other study, and then we'll summarize, and we'll have lots of time for questions tonight. So this is a different kind of study, and it's also came out like in November of last year. Very recent stuff. Okay, it's by professors from Tufts and Harvard University, and they compiled with the World Bank's help a big empirical data set on how the carbon tax policies that actually existed in 31 countries in Europe over a 30-year period, 1990 to 2019. Okay, so this is massive data from what actually happened. This isn't models projecting forward. Hey, what's going to happen? Well, we've got to create all these assumptions. Few assumptions needed here. This is what actually happened. This was the actual impact on GDP over the shorter term for those countries. And what you'll see here is that it's positive. Okay, at least for the first 3 years, it dips down slightly in year 4, but then longer term, it's a positive impact on GDP, and that should surprise no one. Okay, so you've got the model saying this is what we expect. This is what has actually happened in Europe. It's also been positive for British Columbia as well. So strong evidence. Now you're seeing why. Why do all these economists support CF&D? And for those few of you that haven't seen this before, editorial in the Wall Street Journal, January 2019, largest public statement by economists in history supporting we've got to address climate change, do it through a gradually rising tax on carbon, wherein all the money goes back to households. CFD, put on a border carbon adjustment. That's all this says here. So, so now you're beginning to see why it has such near universal support from economists. Very little impact on the economy, and it's generally positive, tremendous benefits. Polluting can't be free. It just can't. It would be the ruin of us. Let me see. So just wanted to summarize, and then we'll take questions. And go ahead, put your questions in the chat. Be the best way to go, and Leah or I will read them out. I'll be all about the chat in a minute. So if these tremendous climate and health benefits are not included, there's a slight GDP impact. It could be positive, could be negative. For CFD, more times than not, it's going to be negative. Let me give you a brief on something we'll discuss in week 5 of the course. This is mostly Rick talking. Why do we support CFD then? If it has a little more negative impact on the economy, way better for the poor. It is uniquely the climate policy that is good for the poor. No other revenue neutral carbon taxes, regulations are not. So that's why we support it. If just the economic component of these benefits, health and climate. So again, on health, just the wages of the person that died, not the value of their life. If just those are included, short-term GDP impact is positive, long-term GDP impact is very strong. This is clearly good for the economy. It's very good for our health. A primary takeaway of this talk should be not addressing climate change will just tremendously adversely, it could ruin the economy as well as our health. You know, the IMF is saying there, we think 25% reduction in GDP by the end of the century is kind of a minimum. What we're doing here is that the economic argument for a policy like ours, a revenue neutral carbon tax, is so strong. That's why it has overwhelming support. It really is good for the economy. It really is fabulous for society as a whole. Increasingly, we'll demonstrate that standing in the peer-reviewed literature in this course. And the more comfortable you are with that argument, the more that you can evidence it, if you will. I just think the stronger the advocate you'll be, and that's my intent here. That's me, Jerry Hinkle. I'm one of the 3 people in research under Danny, myself, Rick Knight, and Sarah Wanis. I do the economics. And the other thing that I like to just remind people about is there is a white paper that that supports everything in this course with links. So anything that I say, you can go back to the white paper. You can go to those links if you want additional information. Everything, it's a bit of a shift for us. Everything here, we're not doing our analysis of the bill. We're looking and seeing what the independent experts say about policies like this as reflected in the peer-reviewed literature. It's more credible. Then we get to speak from the same script as the people that Congress is relying for on advice in order to design climate policy. And we're really at the beginning stages of that. Tonight, what we're going to do, we'll spend the majority of the time on this first objective. We want to better understand, we want to try and quantify in dollar terms annual climate benefits from a policy like ours. And what we're going to see is that these are tough to measure, but very conservatively, they're well over $300 billion a year. Health benefits are easier. From reduced air pollution, it is worth about $700 billion a year. We touched upon that last week. And so the total, even after subtracting out the potential economic costs from a diminished GDP, the benefits of this policy are about $1 trillion a year and will grow over time from that. So really, really valuable to the economy and society. That's what we'll go over. The agenda, the sequence, if you will, we'll do climate benefits, health benefits briefly, and I'll say it now. Rob Byron, Dr. Rob Byron is on the call with us. He's not going to speak. He is one of the co-leads of our health action team, and he's really an expert in this area. So I'll give you a little bit on it, but if you've got more challenging questions, hold them for the question and answer session, and Rob will be here. He's really, really pretty much an expert in this area. And then finally, we'll look at net benefits, and we'll do questions. So this is my little bit of review from last week. The bottom line from last week is that GDP cares only of the economy. So it's not going to include broader measures of welfare, of well-being. And the example that we used is economic analysis shows this, that the value of a life in America is worth several $1 million. And that's value, but it's not economic value. The economic value of a person, of a premature death or a premature death avoided is what our policy is going to give us, is actually just the wages that they would have earned in a given year or over the course of the rest of their life, okay? So this is a limited value, but what we see is even in the shorter term here, 2021 to 23, 36 to 38, 50 to 52, when the measure of GDP includes these benefits, it's positive. So a policy like ours, this is an IMF study that simulates a CF&D policy, okay? And what it shows is that GDP is increased in the shorter term as a result of a policy to address emissions, okay? It's a winner for GDP in the short term, but not by a whole lot, it doesn't look like here. This is a very conservative measure. However, in the longer term, here we're talking about real GDP in the year 2100. Over the course of the century, what happens is that if we don't address climate change, it really has devastating impacts on the economy. We saw that it was expected to reduce GDP by the end of the century by at least 25%. And if you put on this type of CFD policy here, by the end of the century, according to the red bar, and I'll explain that over the course of this, this is the more recent study that contains the more updated science, GDP will be at least 16% higher. That's a lot. So our policy is good for GDP in the short term, really good for GDP in the long term. This is good for the economy. Now let's look at benefits of the policy more broadly. Let's go beyond the economic impacts to sort of the broader societal impacts, if you will. So what we're going to do initially, emission reductions aren't much from a policy like ours, so benefits aren't much. So we're going to start out 10 years and we're going to estimate what are the benefits of a policy like ours in dollar terms out 10 years. What are the health co-benefits from, and co-benefits again are from greatly reduced air pollution and enhanced health and well-being as a result. And then we'll subtract out any economic cost to arrive at this net policy benefits. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now here's something that's not so straightforward. Trying to estimate the value of climate benefits from a policy. And it relies on this economic concept called the social cost of carbon. So what we're trying to derive here is a value of reduced emissions, of reduced ton of emissions today. Okay, so it takes two things. First, the damages that will accrue from climate change will occur gradually over the course of decades and decades. Okay, so you have to estimate those damages, no easy feat. And then you have to take the present value of those damages to come back to a value today. So two components, what's called a damage function, you know, what are the harms going to be caused and what is their value? And then the discount rate, coming up with an appropriate discount rate. Some of you are into this stuff a little bit more than others, and you know that this has been a great debate in the literature for some time. So I want to, you ever know those authors that write a story, like John Krakauer comes to mind, and he starts the book at the end. He tells you what happened. A bunch of people died on Mount Everest, trying to summit Mount Everest. Anyway, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to give you the answer. So the answer, there is an official measure in the US of the social cost of carbon, this value of a ton of emissions avoided. So this is from a 2016 study from the EPA, from a group within the EPA and other agencies called the Internal Working Group, the IWG. And this is the table that they came up with. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And you see this, they decided to use a discount rate of 3%, and that has a significant impact. And the number that they came up with then by 2020 would be $42 a ton. Now, if you add inflation to 2021 dollars, this gets you to that $51 a ton that the Biden administration just announced. So we have an official social cost of carbon. And I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just beating this up good, because it's too conservative. If you and I want to honestly go out and conduct advocacy for this incredibly important policy, we got to get a little closer to the truth. And this isn't close. So I'm going to go into that now for you. A couple of weaknesses, if you will, here. This was based on the average of 3 different models. Maybe some of them you've heard of. DICE from Professor Nordhaus, who just won the Nobel Prize, Fund, and Page. So those are the 3 models. They took an average. Couple of things to note. They're dated. This work is older. And I've got the links for you in the white paper. The vast majority of this, almost all the science is from before 2009 or before. A lot of it comes from the 90s. We've learned a lot about climate change. This is just a little bit old, and the more recent estimates are stronger. Second, we'll make real clear, it's incomplete. All they've included in the damage function, like what are the harms done by carbon emissions, is what we know is going to happen and can measure, can quantify, can put a value to. We're not going to be able to include what we pretty much know is going to happen, but can't quantify, and what we don't know is going to happen. Like, for example, let me give you examples of each. What we know is going to happen, going to quantify. Okay, well, by the end of the century, sea levels are going to rise. We know about how much. We know about how much coastal property is in harm's way, and as a result, how much value will be lost, right? As a result of a 2-foot or 3-foot sea level rise this century. So that can be quantified. That kind of thing tends to be included. Yeah, but storm surge is going to wipe out a lot more. Yeah, but we can't specify that. We can't quantify it, so we don't. Wildfires, that's a complete unknown. They've been shocking, especially recently. They've been very expensive. It looks like that trend has just begun, but that is not something that we can include in this type of analysis. So it's dated, it's incomplete, and it also would appear that the discount rate being used is too high. And you can see here, you go from a 3% discount rate to 2.5%. Social cost of carbon goes up by almost 50%, goes up $20. So that makes a huge difference. So we'll talk about each of these. Okay, what's included, what's not included. Mortality from heat stress. Now, this is not mortality from air pollution. This is just the climate change element of mortality. Heat stress will kill more people. Agricultural production could be better, could be worse. Labor productivity, when it gets, a lot of work gets done outside, when it gets hotter, people tend to become less productive. Energy demand will change. We'll need less heat. We'll need more air conditioning. Coastal property, we mentioned, leaves a lot on the table. Okay. Ecosystems, natural capital. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but the world gives us a bounty. The fisheries, the trees that we harvest for lumber, agriculture. And if we degrade those, that will come at a cost. Stronger storms, by and large, can't include. Wildfires, not included. Species extinction, you can't put a price to that. Mass migration, which has begun, right? Or certainly has happened in instances as a result of the impacts of climate change. Risk of violent conflict. Morbidity, that you get sick. And then catastrophic events. So there's a lot, and increasingly we're clear this stuff is causes great financial harm, but they're not included in the measures. So they're incomplete. Okay, now the dated nature. I showed you this last week, but not all of you were here last week. So I'm going to go over it once again. Besides, it's just a really valuable graph. Here's a couple of models that look at how climate change, if it's not mitigated, will diminish GDP over time. Okay, so you've got the one here, Burke-Singh, and they estimate that it'll reduce climate change or GDP by 25% by the end of the century. Here's the Nordhaus model in red. It is expected to reduce, or according to that estimate, it'll reduce GDP by 7.5%. So the difference here is significant. This model or this estimate is 3 times larger than the Nordhaus estimate. Well, this is pertinent to us because the Nordhaus dice model is one of the 3 models used in Biden's current estimate. Okay, it's clearly dated, and you get a sense here of how the fact that we're not using the latest science has diminished the estimate. Pretty clear, yeah? More recent science is important. So this is a quote from the IMF paper that graph came from. And I want to go over it with you one more time and just highlight some other things. So the IMF is not indifferent between these two. The IMF says, we think, not only do we think this is the better estimate, but the actual damages are down here. They're greater than this. And here's why. More recent studies, the blue line, Burke-Singh, point to much larger damages than previously estimated, are more in line with the substantial risks scientists have warned about more recently. However, even these estimates are likely to I'm going to back up. Even these estimates are likely to understate benefits from mitigating climate change. And it's because it's incomplete. They're missing high frequency and severity of natural disasters, a rise in sea levels, or they don't take that completely into account, and the risk of more catastrophic climate change. So that's where the IMF is at with respect to this. I want to show you this again because it speaks again, and you may not have, I haven't shown it to you, I think, in this presentation, but I showed it at the national conference. It speaks to how the more recent events of the last decade have really opened our eyes to climate damages. So this is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, okay? And every year they look at billion-dollar climate and weather-related disaster costs, the number of events, and that's in green, and the total dollar value. And what we've done here, Rick and I produced this graph, and we did it, we annualized the events and the dollar value of damages by year. Okay, so this is an annual average. And what you see is that it's up dramatically. But what I want to focus on for this point, most of the science in the models used in the current Biden $51 is from here and before. And it's kind of a different world because, as you may recall, so here it's a little over $50. It's a little over 80 here. Again, inflation adjusted. Damages from climate change are way up. And if you took the average from just the last 5 years of this decade, 2016 to 19, 2015 to 19, the average is over $100. So it's up here. The more recent science begins to reflect what we're learning about just how damaging climate change is going to be. So it's important that we use the most recent. So good news, I always like to tell good news stories. In 2016, when this estimate came out, it was quite clear that it had shortcomings. And so the National Academy of Sciences produced a pretty in-depth analysis in 2017, showing all the ways in which this measure should be improved. And 3 primary categories. They said, use the latest science. Make it much more transparent. What you've got now is 3 economists with 3 black boxes. We need to see what's inside this thing. Okay, and then finally they said we really need to rationalize the discount rate to see if that is, if the one that we're using, if the 3% is appropriate. Then they went a little further. So here's the good news. So, sorry. So the group that took on making these improvements is called the Climate Impact Lab. It's a consortium out of the University of Chicago, okay? And they began this process a couple of years ago, and they're really using the best minds, the best science. They're putting it together, and they're going to have a revised estimate out on the social cost of carbon, quote unquote, in the spring of this year. So it really could be any time. We don't know what that number is going to be, and I won't jump the gun on it. I think it's going to be up significantly. But the person that leads the Climate Impact Lab, Chicago professor Michael Greenstone, came out with a paper just about a month or so ago saying, look, I know the Biden administration is going to revise the social cost of carbon. It's really important. Here's at a minimum what we think they should do for now. We'll come out with a revised estimate shortly, but till then, take that $51 a ton and at least apply a lower discount rate. Instead of 3%, use 2%. 2% is the maximum. Now, I've linked the paper for you that describes why. But basically what he's saying, the one true terminal that we can sort of justify the discount rate in is the long-term risk-free interest rates in America, other sovereign debt, okay? And you should do it on an inflation-adjusted basis. He's got a graph in there, and he shows that in most countries, including America, the long-term interest rates on a real inflation-adjusted basis are actually negative right now, okay? The 10-year treasury rate's about 1.6%, and expected inflation is about 2.2%, so it's actually negative. So he says at a minimum, or excuse me, let me say it differently. Right now, the highest discount rate you should be using is 2%, not 3%, and it makes a world of sense. And if you apply that, the social cost of carbon that you get is $125 a ton. So I'm going to start there. That makes a world of sense to me. And I think that when these revisions begin to come out, so Climate Impact Lab soon in the spring, then the Biden administration next January will come out with its revised formal social cost of carbon. They're going to be a lot higher, and they're going to reflect a lower discount rate. I certainly believe it's certainly justified. Okay, I'm going to take that $125 and I'm going to add just one element. There's many that you could, but this is just too compelling to ignore. Okay, paper came out recently in Nature Sustainability, and they're talking about natural capital. And how they describe natural capital is, you know, in a market economy, you've got an apple tree and it produces fruit, it produces apples. And we value those apples and we price those apples. I can tell you what the value of apples produced in a year are. Natural capital is talking about the well-being of the tree, okay? And they specify, it's particularly clear in timber, ag, and fisheries industries. They're heavily reliant on natural capital. But what they're trying to do here is put a value on, should climate change degrade this natural capital, and so degrade the capacity of these industries to produce on an ongoing basis. And so they took the DICE model, they altered it to call it green DICE, and they ran estimates for natural capital and the degree to which those damages from climate change would add to the social cost of carbon. And what they found was that if you just took the direct impacts of the damage to natural capital, the price went from, in DICE, $28 a ton to $72 a ton. In other words, you add $44 to it, okay? If you took the indirect impacts on natural capital, the social cost of carbon went all the way up to $160 a ton. I'm not going to do that here, but I am going to take the $44. So I want to suggest, for our purposes, that a reasonable social cost of carbon for us to assess the value of our policy in terms of the value of climate benefits from reduced emissions, we can use $169 a ton. And I want to assert that it's still conservative. And I'll give you the same 3 reasons again. One, because it's still incomplete. We're really relying on that $51 a ton, right? It doesn't have a number, it doesn't have wildfires, damages from stronger storms, etc., which are clearly becoming important. Okay, it's clearly, not only is it incomplete, but it is dated. That number is still based on science from 2009 and really earlier. And the discount rate at 2% probably could be lower. So 169 a ton, and I want to say that that's conservative. It's a lower bound, if you will. I shouldn't have HR 763 up there. Be EICDA, sorry about that. That's a no-no. So here's where we're going to come out. According to the RFF carbon pricing calculator, here again, in 10 years' time, EICDA will reduce emissions by 2.18 billion tons. Okay? If you value those at $51 a ton, as the Biden administration formally is now, in 10 years' time, the value of our policy would be $113 billion. Not bad. Clear for my liking to hand you as advocates, it's way too conservative. We know that. It's going to go up, and we'll see that shortly, I believe. I think 169 is still conservative. That yields a value, again, an annual value. It'll grow between now and 10 years, and it will continue to grow after that because emissions will continue to be reduced. But it puts you at $368 billion a year. I hope that's clear how I got to that. Again, the paper is a backup, and if not, please, we're going to have plenty of time for questions. What's the actual? This is going to be one of those where if you wait until the proof is in the pudding, like in 30, 40 years, we're going to have a much better feel for just how damaging climate change is. We can't wait. And a lot of people describe the need for policy to reduce emissions now as an insurance policy against what could happen. But we'll go with 368 for now. Sometimes it doesn't want to go. Health co-benefits, we went over this briefly last time, but I'll get into a little bit more detail. And again, Dr. Byron is here if you want even more so. So when I first started this job 3.5 years ago, we had an estimate of the health co-benefits of a policy like ours, and it was $250 billion a year. And what has occurred is that we've simply got better data. We're learning more about just how impactful, just how deadly air pollution is. The primary component here is particulate matter, which gets into the lung. This is not my field. Causes terrible asthma, lung disease, and I don't know what else. We'll wait till Rob speaks at the end. But this analysis came out from Dr. Drew Shindell, a leading expert in the field, Duke University, and his team. They were able to access much more granular data on air pollution and its impacts from NASA. They came out with revised estimates in August. It's not published yet. It's now in peer review, but Dr. Shindell assures me that that all of the methodologies used to derive these numbers are peer reviewed. So I'm going with it. And the numbers have increased significantly. So over a 50-year period on average, if you were to reduce emissions consistent with a 2C policy, and HR 763 gets you down to about 1.8, so it reduces emissions even more, you would avoid 90,000 premature deaths a year, 70,000 hospitalizations, 6 million adult lost work days, and a number of other benefits as well. Many millions of reduced child visits to ER for asthma. Asthma is a significant consequence. Dr. Schindel is able to value these at $700 billion a year, primarily because life is really valuable in this country. So this is a lot easier to estimate the value of, and I feel like we can really hang our hands on it. Our policy is going to greatly reduce air pollution, and in so doing, we're going to be a lot healthier. We're going to be able to stabilize climate risk, greatly improve our health, help the economy, and help society generally with this. So to give you the net, I want to estimate an economic cost. Okay, and this is a slide that you've seen before. This is Noah Kaufman's December 2019. He runs a policy here that is similar enough over the first 10 years to EICDA. Okay, it starts at $50 a ton and then increases gradually from there. So it's a similar carbon price. This simulation says that GDP in 10 years' time would have been 27,653 billion. Under this policy, it's 27,555. That's a reduction of $98 billion in that year. And that's consistent enough with the EMF 32 that I'm going with it. I think it's the most reliable estimate that we have of economic costs of our policy. So if you don't include any of the benefits at all, GDP would be 100 billion lower in 10 years' time. Really not much. So here's my estimate of net benefits. Climate benefits of 368, but I'm clear it's conservative. 700 billion for the health co-benefits. That's conservative as well because we'll reduce emissions more. Economic costs around 100 billion a year. Sorry for the spacing on that. Almost $1 trillion a year. So that is my estimate of that. Jobs tonight, and the bottom line will be that job opportunities increase. It's really a great story. So once again, I like to start every session with letting you know, one, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in this. I think it's a critical part of our advocacy because the economic argument is so strong. A policy generally like this is so unquestionably good for the economy, and then on a broader level, and we'll talk about that a little bit today, good for society. So, and the more comfortable you are with that argument, the better it is. And there's kind of sort of nothing more important to folks than jobs. It's me and Leah again tonight. Leah is my wing person, and I am the economic research coordinator. I work in research and have for 3.5 years now with it's myself, Rick Knight, and Sarah Wanis. What a team. Now, a little bit of, before I jump into this, in fact, I'll go here. I just want to summarize what we've said to this point, because it's great stuff. In the first week, what we saw was that carbon taxes are really effective. That's one of their big advantages. They're really effective at reducing emissions. And in fact, a policy as strong as EICDA can actually get you to the promised land, which is net zero by 2050, really a target that is embraced by most climate advocates. That's what we're shooting for. And so it's really special. It's not just a target for us. We've got a plan to get there. And having legislative language in a bill, it's all out in the open. You get to see clearly what the costs are, what the benefits are. So let the games begin. You can really start having a conversation about policy when you've got a plan there. So we got a plan that will get you all the way to net zero by 2050. It does require some slight strengthening of certain complementary policies, and we'll talk more about those in week 6. But R&D funding is a really good thing, and it's supportive. A little more R&D funding on low carbon technologies. Energy efficiency standards tend to be able to get at where the market struggles. So standards for appliances, standards for buildings. That is part of these, stronger complementary policies. And third, air pollution regulations that kind of cause or push the closure of coal-fired power plants a little bit earlier than they would have been. But anyway, you get those additional complementary policies. Our baseline carbon price puts you on a path to net zero by 2050. Emission reductions, we nail it. Then GDP, and this is a key measure of, but we hear it'll wreck the economy. Will it? No, the peer-reviewed literature says that when you include just the economic component of the health and climate benefits, it's clearly good for GDP, positive to GDP in the short term, and really, really positive to GDP in the long term, because in the long term, the climate benefits really kick in. If you don't address climate change, you're going to get clobbered. Okay, it's around a 25% or more reduction to GDP by the end of this century. It won't be the same. If you do address it, you can greatly enhance GDP. And then last week, last week we went beyond just the economy, GDP. We wanted to look at the benefits from the policy in a broader fashion. Okay, and I'll go over that a little bit next. And what we saw was that there was $1 trillion, and we can stand behind these numbers. There's $1 trillion in net benefits a year from our policy. That's huge. Where do we get that $1 trillion? Well, the health benefits are key here. Carbon pollution also brings air pollution, particulate matter. It's really, really bad for our health. We're finding this more and more. Now, the economic impact of someone dying, what we found was that a policy like ours would save 90,000 premature deaths every year on average for 50 years. Okay. The economic component of that is just someone's annual salary, basically. That's what you've earned. That's what you've contributed to the economy. But one's life is worth far more than that. So if you include that element, the non-economic component of the benefits, they're worth on a net basis about $1 trillion a year. We'll see a little bit more of that because I want to clarify some things. So here's what we're going to do tonight. First of all, I'm going to tell you what I can't tell you. And that's that the standard models that we use for evaluating the economic impacts and the emissions impacts of a revenue neutral carbon tax, they can't readily evaluate job impacts. So we can't go there. And I'm not going to be able to give you, as Remy did, a number. Here, if you pass our policy, here's the number of jobs that you'll get out of it. I would love to give you that. I know volunteers like that kind of stuff. I can't give it to you. I can speak generally, though, and here's number 2. It's clear on a net basis, job opportunities are going to increase as a result of the policy. And in the most impacted sector, in the electric power sector, job opportunities will increase 3 to 1. And we'll get 3 new opportunities for every 1 lost in the fossil fuel sector. And then finally, you know, when the job situation is that good, something that people commonly ask is, yeah, but are they good jobs? And what we find is absolutely. They're better than average in terms of compensation and benefits on the national average. And they're on par with the fossil fuel jobs. They're more likely, slightly more likely to be unionized as well. So that's what we're going to see tonight. So it's sort of this fourth leg, if you will. The job impacts from a policy like ours is really good. Job opportunities will increase. Okay, how are we going to go about this? And by the way, we'll all be out of here in time for the 9 o'clock Eastern start of the NCAA finals game. So don't worry about that. We're gonna end a little bit early tonight, depending on questions, because there's a little less material. We'll look at what we can say about the job impact from a policy, and we'll see if we can't get specific. Then we'll look specifically at the electric sector, the electricity sector, and the jobs impact. Then we'll evaluate the compensation from clean energy jobs, and then we'll take questions. So here we go. And as I did last time, I want to do a little review for you, in part because I don't think I stated this very clearly last week, and I want to make sure that it's clear because it's very valuable. This is from the IMF report, okay? And so once again, the IMF, in a report that just came out in October, 6 months ago, they did something that makes my life much easier. They did a survey of the literature on mitigating climate change on a global basis mostly, and what the economic impacts of that were. And so here's they've gathered some literature. They took it to representative studies here, okay? And this is the impact of GDP if we don't address climate change. Okay, the red line is the Nordhaus model. And what you see is that it takes time, but then the economic impact of not addressing climate change becomes really pretty significant. That's about 7.5% of GDP is going to be detracted by the end of the century. And that, so in our economy today, that's like $1.5 trillion. That's real money. That's significant. But then there's another study, the blue line from Burke Singh Miguel, okay? And that has much more significant degradation to the economy, to GDP, as a result of climate change, if it's not mitigated. 25% of GDP. Think about how much 25% of your paycheck is, and then apply that to everybody. This is huge. This is crushing the economy. And what the IMF said about these two models was not unbiased in any way. What they said was this blue line, this study is much more recent. This is dated. Okay, Nordhaus is dated. This is much more recent and is consistent with the more recent science. But not only that, they said they thought that total economic damages would be worse than this, because both of these studies are, so this one's dated, but this one, as they must be, is incomplete. So there are major impacts expected from climate change on the economy that we just can't measure. And because we can't measure them, studies like this, peer-reviewed studies, can't include them. And they talked about elements of sea level rise, stronger storms, wildfires. These are already having an impact on the economy. They're very costly. For the last 5-6 years, 100 billion a year in the US. Can't include those. And that's with 1%, or excuse me, that's with 1 degree centigrade temperatures. As temperatures increase, things like that, which are not included here, are going to be really damaging to the economy. So the IMF says we think damages will be greater than this. Why was it important for last week's conversation? Last week, we were trying to develop this economic metric, the social cost of carbon. How much damage does a single ton of carbon emissions do to the economy now on a present value basis? And what we noted is that it's this model that is included in that estimate. There's 3 models. This Nordhaus's DICE is one of them. And so we asserted that $51 a ton, which is currently anyway, it won't be for long, but currently it's the formal estimate of the administration. We think climate damages and the social cost of carbon is much higher than that. And I proposed a different measure to you, or a different social cost of carbon. So here's where we came out. Okay. EICDA in 10 years time. So I'm measuring this in 10 years. The benefits initially are going to be less. Why? Because emissions aren't that much reduced, and the benefits are completely a function of how much we reduce emissions. Okay, so in 10 years time, we EICDA reduces emissions about 2 billion tons a year. We put the social cost of carbon at 169 a year. That was what was recommended by the Climate Impact Lab, plus some money for natural capital. This is still conservative. This has still got that $51 in it, right? Just with a lower discount rate. We reduced the discount rate from 3% to 2%. Anyway, climate benefits between 300 and 400 a year, health benefits 700 a year, economic costs 100 billion a year. We can stand behind this number. The benefits to society of our policy are in the neighborhood of $1 trillion a year. You should feel real good about what you're advocating for, because it is monstrously good for the economy and society. So I say that a lot, but it just kind of rolls off the tongue, comes off real easy. So, hey, go ahead. If you've got questions on any of that or anything from the first 3 segments of the course, go ahead and put them in chat now, and Leah will begin to aggregate those questions, and I'll be able to answer them for you. We'll have more time for questions tonight. So, CGE models and jobs. In the first and second weeks of the course, we looked at the EMF 32 study. Really cool. 11 models evaluating the economic impacts of the exact same set of revenue neutral carbon tax policies. Really a comprehensive study out of Stanford and Brookings. And yet, 11 models, 15 articles, they didn't say anything about jobs. Why was that? Same with the Columbia report, right? Noah Kaufman and team, while at Columbia, did an evaluation of our model, didn't say anything about jobs, or didn't say much about it. RFF calculator, very sort of in-depth analytical study of our policy and others, didn't say anything about jobs. Why is that? Well, let me tell you a little bit about what EMF 32 did say. So CGE models, this stands for computable general equilibrium. These models require an assumption of equilibrium for them to work. Now, what does that mean? Equilibrium equating, so the markets in the model, the markets within the economy equilibrate. Essentially, the amount supplied every year of a product and all products ends up equaling the amount that people want at the given price. So the market's clear. That's kind of how these things need to run. So an example, you got the market for oil, and then OPEC comes along and decides to significantly restrict oil production. Now, maybe the market was in balance, and boom, now there's a lot less supply, but people still want oil. What happens? The price of the product, the price for oil in this case, changes. In this case, increases significantly to impact the amount, the quantity that is demanded, so that the markets, in addition, folks that supply oil, the wildcat folks in Texas and North Dakota and Pennsylvania, at a higher price, maybe they add more to production. So the price changes to equilibrate the two, and that's equilibrium. That kind of makes sense, yeah? They call it supply and demand in Econ 101. Well, labor is just another market. And it also is required by these models to be in equilibrium. And how we translate that in these models, this equilibrium condition for the labor market, is that everybody who wants a job has one, okay? If something were to happen to strengthen the economy, and if the demand for workers went up, one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to veer from the textbook a little bit here. One of two things is going to happen. If the economy was weaker before, if there were a number of people that wanted jobs, if unemployment was high, as has been the case over the last year, right? We added almost 1 million jobs last month. Well, if there was slack in the economy and something happened, like the current policies going on, to bolster the economy, right? Then, you know, those people would be added to the labor force and you'd get a reduction in unemployment, okay? But if the market's already tight, if you're already at something reasonably like full employment, 5% unemployment, call it, then what's going to happen if something occurs to increase the demand for labor? What's going to happen is that wages will likely increase. So what's going to happen to jobs in these models? In the non-policy scenario or the reference scenario, no carbon tax, everybody's got a job that wants one. Okay, then you put in the carbon tax policy. We can tell you the impact on emissions. We can tell you the impact on GDP. What's the impact on jobs? After that carbon tax comes in, everybody that wants a job has one. These models can't address jobs well, so they don't. And that's why we're talking about 13 different models here. Nobody said anything about jobs. Now, we did get an analysis of jobs from REMI. It's a different kind of model. And the peer-reviewed literature has kind of not looked kindly upon that particular type of approach. So I don't really present it here. You know, there may be some value. I think they may have come close to getting it right, but we're sticking to the peer review literature here, and they say that it's not that simple. It's not that simple. There's another model out there now. It's the one used by the House Select Committee to forward their policy suggestion last year. And they did an analysis of the House policy. Now they will give you, similar to REMI, they will give you a jobs impact. It's called the Energy Innovation, that's the name of the firm. And the model is EPS, Energy Policy Simulator. They'll give you a jobs number. Once again, the peer-reviewed literature would say, we don't think that's sufficiently accurate. So anyway, these models won't give us a specific number. Sorry about that. Can't do it for you. Here's what I can tell you, and it's a good story. So bear with me. What happens when we put on our revenue neutral carbon tax? We're back to the EMF 32 slide, one of the slides. Let's look down here at the bottom row, because this is the strongest carbon tax, $50 plus 5% a year. Okay. What we saw is that the predominant impact of a carbon tax is here on the blue lines that tend to jump all the way down or fall all the way down, these lines. Emissions are dramatically reduced in the electricity sector. The other sectors, not so much. And the green is the total, so don't look at that for now. But the blue consistently across models, 75% reductions, 90%, 90%, 95%, consistently huge reductions in the power sector. What's going on there? What's going on is that there's a steady shift of resources and jobs from fossil fuels as a source of energy to renewables and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency becomes far more profitable. Okay. So what we are able to say something about is what happens when there's that shift from fossil fuels to, in the electricity sector. So I'm back to my IMF study, which again, they have been kind enough to survey the literature. And again, when you're talking to folks, when you're talking to your member of Congress, it's not Jerry's view. It's not Jerry's survey of the literature. This is the International Monetary Fund in a very important report. Okay, on page 92, they summarized what happens with employment. Two key conclusions, if you will. The first one, here's what happens. Production in renewable energy is more job intensive than electricity generation based on fossil fuels. If you put on a carbon price and you move from fossil fuels to renewable energy, you're going to get an increase in job opportunities. And the reason is with renewables, with energy efficiency, it just takes more people. It takes less capital, less machinery, and more people to get it done. And I can't readily specify exactly where those jobs are, but we'll see in a minute that it's, again, 2 to 3 times. One other conclusion that I think is just really important on a couple of fronts. Okay, in general, the job effects seem larger and net negative in response to changes in non-market policies. So a little bit of context. What they're saying here is, if you try to reduce emissions through regulation, non-market policies, it's not going to be so good for the economy. It's not going to be so good for jobs. You're going to get a larger net negative response. So this is just something to keep in mind. At CCL, we're completely open to regulations. I mean, we need to do what it takes to reduce emissions, whatever can pass. And that's not the official CCL language. But you should know, we're standing behind market-based policies and a carbon tax because it's significantly better for the economy. It's significantly better for jobs. This is the IMF saying it, not just CCL saying it. Okay, second part of the conclusion. Okay. Whereas market policies, carbon tax, they mention feed-in tariffs, trading programs would be kind of like a cap and trade, but a price on carbon, have a more muted, so a smaller impact on jobs, and it's net positive. So their view is that this will grow job opportunities. Okay, nice. Here's the specific. Here's the graph they show. We're going to take 2 different cuts at the same apple here. This is a study that looked at the labor required sort of over the production life cycle, the construction of the plant, the generation of electricity, et cetera, by gigawatt hour of electricity generated, okay? And here's what we see. I'll start with fossil fuels. This is job years per gigawatt. Okay, so coal and natural gas, it takes about 0.2 job years to generate a gigawatt. Okay, energy efficiency, about twice that, 0.4 person years, labor years. Hydro and nuclear, a little bit more. Now here's renewables. Solar, a lot more, 7.5 times more. Hydro, geothermal, wind, that's at about 0.4 as well, so about twice as much for wind, etc. So summary point, exactly as the IMF has said, renewables and energy efficiency is more labor intensive. As we implement a policy that reduces fossil fuel production of electricity and goes to renewables and energy efficiency, we're going to create job opportunities. I want to underline a point here, which is important. Again, we'll hear it's a job killer. Let's have some compassion for that statement. I mean, you need to be more complete than that, but let's have some compassion. There is going to be significant job losses. Where? In fossil fuels, but generally in industries that pollute more. Resources and jobs will move away from fossil fuels and industries that pollute more. And they will move towards, and significantly even more so, to cleaner industries. But there's going to be some real pain. So is it a job killer? Not on a net basis. But yeah, there will be jobs lost. And I know that we have sympathy for and compassion for the real pain for communities that will lose these jobs. And I know that there are bills out there that want to address that, and I think it's great. But I'm not speaking for CCL isn't going there yet, I think, because we need to stick to a very simple and bipartisan policy. But we get it. So is it a job killer? Well, you're going to lose some jobs from polluting industries. On a net basis, there's going to be a big increase in job opportunities. One more slice of the apple. This time, and this may be more pertinent, because what's going to happen is when a policy like ours is implemented, investment is going to shift away from fossil fuels and to energy efficiency. So this is per $1 million invested. Okay, fossil fuels, the jobs are about 5.2 per million for oil and natural gas. Essentially, this is new money. A lot less new money is going to go to oil and natural gas. You're going to lose some jobs. Same with coal. Okay, so coal here has got about 32% more jobs per million invested. But now we go to energy efficiency. And for the new money invested, the figures are even stronger. Looks like about 3 times for retrofits, and that's going to boom. Okay, mass transit about 4+ times, smart grid 2.5 times. These are the increases here. So building retrofits, you know, it's essentially a little over 3 times, a little over 4 times, about 2.5 times the number of jobs created than were that money to have gone elsewhere. Renewables, similar story, about 2.5 times, 2.5 times, about 3 times here. So again, summary point, pretty straightforward. A carbon price will lead to a boon in job opportunities. There's going to be a nasty transition, but there will be a boon in job opportunities. It's a good thing. We're going to try to produce a report for you in a couple months before June to give you some more specifics on this, but wait and see for that. So we'll try to do a little better. Okay. Now, remember I told you these models can't give you an estimate of job impacts. This is not one of these models. We'd seen this before on the second day, on the second course, when we looked at GDP. This is not projecting forward what will be the job impacts. This is looking at what has already occurred. This is actual, this is empirical analysis. And again, this is the Harvard and Tufts economists, a study in the top economics journal in the country, the American Economic Review, just a few months ago. And they looked at 31 European countries that had a price on carbon over 30 years, 1990 to 2019. And what they saw was that the impact on jobs was initially, clearly, statistically, significantly positive. So for you statisticians, these numbers are statistically significant. There's a slight bump up in jobs. Okay, and again, this is not job opportunities. This is employment's increasing in the economy. Okay, year 3, 4, it's down to just about flat, but maybe a little below. Long term, really flat. No impact on net jobs. Doesn't say anything about wages, but as a result of these carbon tax policies. But you can show this to folks. Is it a job killer? Never has been. Not on a basis, not on a net basis, not expected to be going forward. The jobs story really is a good one. One other segment, and we'll get to your questions. It's important to understand that these are going to be good jobs. So, disclaimer, this is not a peer-reviewed study, but research has done a little bit of work to verify these numbers. They're straight out of BLS. This is like spreadsheet stuff. Okay. What we've seen is there's this category in this study called clean energy jobs. Okay, and it's the solar construction implementation, putting them up, and then maintenance, right? Wind, construction, and then maintenance of those processes. These jobs have been on the rise lately, and also including energy efficiency. They've been growing at 6%. 2017, 18, and 19 have been growing at 6% a year. The national economy, only 3%. So they're growing twice as fast as the national economy. Fossil fuels have actually been on decline. So it's already happening even without a carbon price. And there's some growing political clout as a result. People like these jobs. What about compensation? The wages are 25% higher than the national average. They're more likely to have health and retirement benefits than the national average. But it's the same with fossil fuels. They get better compensation as well. Turns out these clean energy jobs are comparable to, the wages are slightly higher than fossil fuel jobs. So we're going to lose some jobs, but the compensation and the benefits of those that take their place will be just as good. And that's a great story. And, you know, that doesn't mean that you can move from West Virginia readily to wherever the solar is being installed or wherever the wind is. It's not that there won't be hardship, but we're going to have lots of good jobs as a result of this policy with good compensation. Hey, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. This is the 5th session of the Economic Benefits of Carbon Fee and Dividend course. Once again, the economic argument is just really strong, and so the purpose of this course is to arm you with that so that you can discuss that with people you're advocating with greater confidence and with greater detail, because it really is a winning argument. Just want to go over briefly with you what we've done in the first 4 sessions. So in the first session, what we saw, it's pretty remarkable. We actually have a plan, soup to nuts, legislative language that attains this goal of net zero by 2050. I continue to get questions on this, so I'll say a little bit about it. To get there, it does require a bit of strengthening of complementary policies, slightly stronger air pollution standards that cause the retirement of coal, energy efficiency standards in buildings and in for appliances. And then finally, am I going to remember it? Our government R&D spending, which is already underway, has already begun, but a strengthening of that is valuable. But that gets us there. And I look at some of the proposals coming out, all of which we respect, like the Biden infrastructure plan. It's a great plan. It is, fully supportive of the $1 trillion or so that goes towards climate over 10 years. And, know that that's not going to achieve anything close to net zero by 2050, for example. So you should be very proud of advocating for a full-on plan that achieves the goal that that's so important to us, that can really help stabilize climate risk. GDP, if you include the health and climate benefits, it's positive in the short term. It's really, really positive in the long term with a carbon tax. And the reason is global warming, climate change. will wreck the economy in the long term, according to estimates. At least a 25% reduction in GDP by 2100. So our policy is going to contribute, is going to add to GDP. That's a good thing. If you look at the benefits of the policy a bit more broadly, include not just the economic components, like the lost wages of someone who has passed, but the total societal value. The benefits of a policy like ours equal about $1 trillion a year, and that's the net benefits. Hugely beneficial. So these are reasons why economists are so supportive. And then jobs. Clearly, there will be an increase in job opportunities as a result of this policy. I know I'm getting a little unstable. So Rick, tonight we'll talk about the distribution of benefits, and then next week, important topic, we'll talk about comparing a carbon pricing policy with a regulatory policy to reduce emissions. That's it. Hey, my good friend and colleague Rick Knight is here tonight to talk about the household impact study and the distribution and fairness, and really show that one of the reasons we've chosen this policy is it's really unique in benefiting the poor. That's it, Rick. Thank you for being here, and take it away.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, if you haven't seen Jerry's first four, and of course next week to wrap it up, definitely I recommend it. Great stuff. You'll be very enthusiastic about what we're doing if you're not already. So welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to talk about the distribution and fairness concern, which always gets raised when anybody says the words carbon tax or carbon pricing. So how does the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act affect American pocketbooks? We're going to find out. Okay, so my name is Rick Knight. I'm a research coordinator mainly for science and policy, although we don't actually have that title, but that's what I focus on. And in the non-virtual world, I live in Brookfield, Illinois, where I also serve as one of 3 state coordinators. My background is in chemical engineering and energy research, but I retired from that career in 2016 to focus on climate change. And I've been working for Danny Richter in the research department since 2018. Now, there are 3 questions I want to try to answer for you tonight. First, what will happen to families under the Energy Innovation Act when energy prices rise? Second, does this policy really protect the poor and disadvantaged, as CCL claims? And third, do we have solid data to back up our claims? I'm going to take on each of these questions and then try to leave a good 15 minutes at the end to tackle your questions, whatever they may be. So first off, let's set it up by following the money. We know the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act levies a carbon fee on coal, oil, and gas, which goes to a carbon dividend trust fund. And naturally, the buyers of these fuels, utilities, refiners, manufacturers of all kinds, they'll have to pay more for those fossil fuels, and they will pass along at least part of those price increases to their customers, people like you and me, buying electricity, gasoline, heat for our homes, and lots of products that are made with some amount of energy. So then the cycle is closed by paying carbon dividends to households, or as we're calling it now, carbon cashback payments. That poses the question, then how does this work out for people? And that's what CCL really wanted to know. And this was first addressed in 2015 when we hired an expert to do a formal analysis. So let me look at how this was done. The calculations dealt with 2 main elements. First, the carbon fee cost to US households, how much of that extra fuel cost they end up paying. The study used state and federal data on the carbon intensity of energy of all kinds, right down to the zip code level. Then it used federal data to relate household consumption, which is related to income, to carbon footprint. That's really household spending. It also considered how much of the carbon fee cost would be passed through to consumers. And it turns out that this varies by the type of product, but averages around 85%. Finally, the study made corrections to account for under and over reporting of income and expenditures, differences between what people claim and what the numbers really are. Now, the other main element is the carbon dividend payments to U.S. households, equal dividends per person, with children under 19 getting a half share, which is all spelled out in the legislation. And finally, the income tax burden was factored in because the carbon dividends are treated as taxable income. So now I'll outline the project history. The first iteration was completed in 2016, and this was before any bill was introduced. So it was based on CCL's carbon fee and dividend proposal, which was somewhat different from the bill that Ted Deutsch introduced in 2018. That data analyst was Mr. Kevin Ummel, who was then with the International Institute for Applied Analysis. Mr. Ummel issued a working paper along with state and district level summaries that we were able to use in lobby meetings, meetings with potential supporters. And in January 2019, the bill was reintroduced after late in 2018. And a bunch of other things had changed as well. So in late 2019, we commissioned an update of the study from Kevin Ummel to account for the policy changes in the bill, as well as fresh data on carbon emissions, changes in tax law, economics, and demographics, as well as new research on pass-through that I mentioned. So the new study, which was completed in June of 2020, matched up closely with the actual bill language. So now let's see the results. Let's start with the economic status, which arranges households into 5 quintiles, ranked by consumption, which simply means household spending on goods and services, and is related closely to income. So first of all, direct energy costs are affected by the carbon fee. That means gasoline, electricity, energy for heating and cooking. This is the amount that the average household would see passed down to them from the carbon fee in that first year. This study only covers year 1. For context, average household income in quintile 1 is about $30,000. In quintile 2, $52,000. That's the household income. And it goes to $70,000, then $93,000, and finally in the top quintile, the average income is $159,000. Now next, here's indirect energy costs. That means all the other goods and services we buy that use some fossil energy before they get to us. That is how much average households will pay in additional costs for all that stuff due to the carbon fee. These combined energy costs are from that 85% of pass-through. And finally, financial asset costs. Now, this is a little different. It represents the carbon fee costs that were not passed down by businesses in their prices, but it hits the fossil energy investments that are buried in people's stock portfolios or bank accounts. And as you can see, the wealthier households who have a lot more of those investments are far more affected by that component. So those are the costs. And here's what it adds up to in dollars in that first year. From $273 at the low income level and up to $921 at the high end on average. Now, I don't know if I've done this in the past to run a poll to answer a couple of questions. Can we do that, Leah? Are we able to do a poll?
I think we can do a poll. You want to do a live poll?
Yeah, I want to do a live poll and ask people, how much do you think a household in the bottom quintile will receive on average in carbon dividends during that first year? Now remember, this is after income taxes are taken out. And there's no penalty if you get it wrong. Then the same question for the top quintile. Now, no, don't cheat by looking at the website. So let's give folks a few minutes to do that. Let's see what kind of results we get.
I
Can
don't
you
know if
tell?
I can set up a poll after the fact. I think we needed to set it up before. But what we can have people do is
Okay.
we can have them put their guesses in the chat if you want, and I can read
Yeah,
them
why don't
out
you do
maybe.
that? Yeah, I think we would
Okay.
have had to set up this poll ahead of time. So
Yes,
if you could
yes,
just put
yes.
some guesses in the chat, and then we can compare them with the real numbers. It'll be interesting to see what people think is going to be the outcome. So give a couple minutes for that. Again, that's your guess of what the total dividends for the year will be for the lowest income quintile and the highest income quintile. Yeah, question was, don't they get the same amount? They do get the same amount before taxes, but that's taxable income. So the net amount of money that people end up with is going to be different. Yeah, I should have made that clear because I think a lot of people don't realize that the dividends are taxable income. And so that's one of the reasons we consider this to be a very progressive policy, because people that pay lower tax rates end up with more money in their pockets. Okay, let's go ahead and see what we end up with. So here are the dividends you get back. Okay. So if you guessed around $500 for the lowest quintile, you were right. And it goes down to about $383 net after taxes for the highest quintile. So you can see households in the bottom 20% do pretty well, almost double their energy cost increases in that first year. The second and third quintiles also come out ahead, and even in the fourth quintile, just below the top 20%, it's pretty much break even. So it's really only the big energy users in that top quintile who, for the most part, end up behind. But here's an important point about that. Compared to their total income, this gap of about $530 only amounts to a tiny percentage of their income. And I'll show you a little more clearly in the next couple slides. So, but it's not really that punitive to high earners. And also consider there's nothing to stop a wealthy household from cutting their costs by investing in solar panels or electric vehicles, or by divesting their stock portfolios from fossil fuels. And those are all things that help the climate. So here's how those same numbers look when you just pull out the net benefit, the difference between the dividends and the costs. And in year one, the median household in the bottom fifth comes out about $240 ahead, and the top quintile about $530 behind. But let's look at it in another way. Here's how those same data in percent look in percent of median household income. So here's what we see. Those extra dollars in their pockets mean a lot more to a family in the bottom of the income scale than that shortfall does to a family at the top. At the bottom, there's a gain of about 0.8% on average versus a loss of only 0.3% at the top. And to corroborate that, I can show you, and other studies support this conclusion. Here's a carbon tax study by the folks at Columbia University. Now, and I'll explain what all these different bars are. It's a little different case because they analyze the carbon tax that starts at $50 a ton and goes up 5% a year. And these results are after 5 years of the policy, but it doesn't really affect the overall direction of the results. So they analyzed 4 different uses of the carbon tax revenue: deficit reduction, reduction of payroll taxes, reduction in corporate taxes, and per capita household rebates, which are essentially carbon dividends. Note that in this analysis, they expressed the results kind of flipped from the way I did. This is a household tax burden. So up is bad and down is good. Anyway, the results show that only the carbon dividend was progressive, meaning the lower income households come out way ahead. In every other version, they get, the technical term is they get screwed. And you can see that the pattern of results, go back, you can see that all these other methods of revenue more or less are bad for the lower income families. So you can see this mirrors the household impact study findings, with the benefit for low income being much bigger than the loss experienced by high income households. So now let's get back to the household impact study and see what else Kevin Ummel discovered. His main metric was to see what percent of households come out ahead in each quintile. Overall, it's 61% of households who come out ahead nationwide. And that actually represents 68% of individuals, because those with more people living under the same roof do the best. Another 24% experience only a minor loss, which means less than 0.2% of their household income. It's the excess of energy costs over dividends. In the bottom quintile, families least able to weather an economic burden, 96% come out ahead, the vast majority of Americans, and only 2% have even a minor loss. Across middle incomes, the majority of Americans, 3 out of the 5 quintiles do quite well. And even at the top, more than half experience either a gain or only a minor loss compared to their income. So another way that Kevin Ummel presented these results was by age. It shows that gains are concentrated in the youngest and oldest households. This reflects the fact that youngest households tend to be larger, including kids who get dividends, and early in their earnings growth. The oldest households, on the other hand, tend to have a lower consumption when they're retired and the kids have moved away. And of course, middle age is where careers are in their prime and consumption is highest. But even there, majorities still come out ahead. Here's another chart addressing a common misconception that rural households will be harder hit because they have to drive longer distances. In reality, there's very little difference between rural, suburban, and urban communities as far as how they do with dividends versus costs. Those longer travel distances in rural areas are offset by other factors, such as lower energy and retail prices. General cost of living is lower. Don't forget, you can spend the dividend however you want. So even if you're spending more for gasoline, you're spending less for food, clothing, and other goods. Of course, district level results may be different because it depends on the composition of the district. Some districts are completely urban. So if you look at the data for your district, it may give you some different results. But this is overall nationwide. You can see very little difference. Another result breaks down by race or ethnicity using the standard federal census. And as you can see, people of color benefit in larger proportions than white households. This is due mainly to economic status and larger, younger families among non-white households. These outcomes are inherent in the policy design. So it's important to understand there's no need for even means testing or any kind of targeting, which would make the policy much more complicated and costly to administer. And the last of the green bar charts that are in Kevin's study, it pertains to various kinds of households of interest to legislators because they're considered most vulnerable to economic burdens. So it looks at families below the poverty line, low income, which means twice the federal poverty line, minorities as a whole, families of 4, older adults, and single parent households. And the results show that a majority of people in groups flagged as most vulnerable have a net gain. families in poverty and low income are most benefited. Only older adults, no, which means households with no children where at least one member of the household is over 65, fail to show gains in more than 70% of households. And that's because there's a significant fraction of older folks who actually are quite well off. But even then, a majority still come out ahead. So that's how you can visualize most of the information in this study and answer questions from potential endorsers, from members of Congress, of course, and members of the public. Now, let's see where you can find the full report and all this other stuff. Yes, for the low, low price of $0, we've made it all available to you, dear viewer, starting with our public website, citizensclimatelobby.org. And if you go to the home page and click on our climate solution, you'll see price on pollution studies. And if you go down and click on that, you'll see this page. And if you scroll down, you'll see this entry, the third one from the top here, saying 2020 Household Impact Study. If you click on that, it takes you to this page, also called, appropriately, 2020 Household Impact Study. And if you keep scrolling down from there and keep going down, down, one more. Okay, here's a screen with 3 useful documents you can download. First is a 2-page summary of the study, which can be a handout or leave behind for lobby meetings or other interested parties. And next, you can access the full study by Kevin Ummel if you want that for reference. And there is a PDF copy of the FAQ, which is also here at the bottom of the page, of the web page. So that's what's available on the CCL public website. Now there's some other related resources on CCL Community and on the Energy Innovation website. Very important is a collection of 2-page handouts for every state and every congressional district. These are PDFs that show some of the household benefit charts specifically for that particular jurisdiction, that state or district. You can get to them in CCL Community by finding resources and training, then all resources, then scroll down to studies and reports, and then find the link to the 2020 Household Impact Study. That page will have links to Google Drives where you can find the handouts. It's a good leave behind for a lobby visit, and I'll show you that page so you don't have to try to remember all this or write it down. Here's that web page. Like I said, you go to resources and training, then you click on all resources, scroll down to studies and reports, and you'll come to this page. And then if you scroll down, you'll come to this screen, and here are the state reports, and here are the district reports. Again, clicking one of these links will take you to a Google Drive. It'll look something like this. And this is the page for the state reports. And you can scroll down to your state. They're all there. And the page for district reports looks similar, except of course there are a lot more of them, 435. So if you double click on one of those reports, you should see a page that looks like this. You can see that it's a 4-page handout. I can't show the whole thing here right now, but it's a 4-page handout with similar looking charts for the state or district you need, and you can download or print it out for your meeting. Now, for just one more resource based on the Household Impact Study that could be very useful, find the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act website, and here's the URL that will take you to this homepage. And you'll see on that page how it works over here. And you go up there and click, and it takes you to another page. And here in the upper right corner is the link to the personal carbon dividend calculator. And you go there and click, and you're on the start page for the calculator. And let's see how we are for time. I think we got time to take a quick tour of the calculator before we move ahead to questions. How it works. I click on that. As I said, takes you to the hard hat page. You see personal carbon dividend calculator. Can everybody see this screen that I'm on? Jerry, are you seeing it? Or Leah?
Yes.
Okay, good. Personal carbon dividend calculator. And there it is. Now, it's been updated for the bill as was reintroduced this year. So I'm going to take us through a little example. Carbon dividend calculator. Click on Get Started. The first thing you got to do is what's called describe your living situation. And what does that mean? If you live alone in your apartment or house, or you live with your family, you click one of these. I live with housemates, or my family lives with housemates, is there for situations where, say, for example, a student is sharing an apartment with other students, then they pay their own utilities, they pay their own fraction of housing costs. So in order to make the energy costs come out right, you would click on this if you're not, say, the head of a family. And this, similarly, if two families, say, share a house, you would go to that situation. Okay, oops, next I gotta go back up and click one of these. I'm gonna say I live with my family, okay? Okay, it wants to hear a little bit about the family. And there's a disclaimer saying this data is not collected or sold to Google or anybody. It's just to perform the calculations for the user. So let's say we have a family of mom and dad, and let's say they have 2 kids, okay? How many adults, how many minors? They need to know the family income because, again, this is in order to make an estimate of your consumption to figure out what your carbon costs will be. So let me pick a number. I don't know, Jerry, throw out a number.
Of course, 64.
What's that, 64?
Yeah.
Whoops. Okay, you can move this slider, or you could actually just type the number right in here if you prefer. Okay, that's the family income. Next, what's the zip code? I'm going to put in the zip code where I used to live in Chicago, 60623. What type of home does the family live in? They live in a house. They have 2 cars. They heat with natural gas. Now let's make it a little, let's show you what these drop downs show. You can choose housing, could be an apartment or a condo, a townhouse, duplex. I'm not sure what other means. I guess if you live in a trailer, maybe, but we're going to stick with standalone house. And the number of vehicles is just a number. And here's the choices for the way you heat your house. So we're going to go with natural gas. That's what's used in Chicago area. Next, some number crunching takes place. A couple more questions now. This is takes a little explaining. These are the typical monthly expenditures for gasoline, for electricity, and for, in this case, natural gas. Now, if you don't know what those numbers are, you can just accept these as being average for the average person with those characteristics, average family with those characteristics. So let's accept that for now and show the results. Okay, for this family, the monthly carbon dividends after taxes will end up at $52. Monthly carbon dividends, yeah, after taxes. And the average monthly carbon fee costs are only $36. So this family comes out $16 ahead for the month. All right. Now let's say they say, well, you know, we have an electric vehicle for one of our cars, and so we only spend half as much on gasoline. So let's lower that to $100, 102. Electricity bill is going to be a little bit higher. But electricity in Chicago area costs about less than half as much as gasoline for the same amount of energy. So let's add, we knocked off $100 for gasoline. Let's add $50. So 168 for electricity for the electric car. And let's see what happened. Hey, what do you know? Average monthly carbon fee costs went down a couple bucks. So they come out a few bucks ahead, further ahead. So you can try this with your own family or for a family of some theoretical composition that you'd like to see. If you want to show a member of Congress, what somebody in their district who was earning the average income and has an average family, what things would look like for them. The calculator will give you a pretty good idea. Now, just one caution, these carbon fee costs, this is an estimate, but there's a big uncertainty. So it ranges from 16 to $52, depending on lifestyle. So if this is a family that just leaves all their windows open with the heat running, or they leave all the lights on all the time, they don't care because they make so much money. They take a lot of vacations to Kathmandu and what have you. Their costs may be much higher, and so they wouldn't come out ahead, but that's the way it's supposed to be. I'd also mention, I think I got a few more minutes here, that there is an FAQ for the calculator. So let me take a look at that, and then we'll move on. So there's a whole long list of whoops. A whole long, you're still seeing my web screen, right? Personal carbon dividend calculator FAQ, right? Okay, so I think that's all I have. Yeah, I'd say thank you, and Jerry, thanks for helping out here. It's always good to have you along, and I'll be seeing you next week to wrap this all up. I hope everybody
Great.
enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you
Next
very
Monday
much.
night, last session.
Yeah.
Hope to see you then.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Very welcome.
Great job, guys.
There you go. So this is the final segment of this 6-segment course on the economic benefits of CF&D. And tonight, really an interesting and very topical topic: regulations versus a carbon price and complementary policies, or what regulatory policies really do fit with the carbon price. So again, the purpose of doing this is the economic argument is really strong, really valuable for our advocacy, and I want to have you be as comfortable with it as possible. Know where the peer-reviewed literature is. On occasion, we get questions to say, hey, do you have a paper that can support that? And increasingly, you'll go back to the white paper and you'll be able to say, yes, I do. So that's me. And Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I probably know a lot of you on the call from being the membership coordinator for 3 years here with Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm now out in Washington, D.C. I've finished my master's in climate science and policy from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'm on the research team now. So I'm lucky enough to work with Jerry and Rick.
And we're glad to have you. Here are the 3 takeaways tonight. What we want to cover: we want to review the most common regulatory policies for reducing emissions. See what those are. We're going to contrast the pros and cons of a regulatory approach versus a carbon tax. And we'll try to get a sense for why is it that CCL really is supporting of using a carbon tax, a price on carbon, for the backbone of the policy, the heart of the policy, that which will do the heavy lifting. Why this? And then finally, we want to understand the regulatory policies that are complementary to a carbon tax versus those that are redundant. See if we can make some sense out of those. The agenda: we'll talk about the common regulatory policies. Then we'll look at why we feel a price should be the backbone of climate policy, and why it's really good policy. We'll look at complementary regulatory policies. That will be Sarah's part, and then we'll do summary and question. So if you've been saving up any great questions, tonight's the night. Okay, so regulation, it's kind of been in the news lately. What has been most apparent, I would say, is this here, that Biden has come out with his infrastructure plan, and he's looking at spending $1 trillion. And in addition to that, I think as part of the plan, there is a clean energy standard. Now, that's for the electric sector only, covers 27% of US emissions, but it's basically a regulatory approach. So regulation has been in the news. In addition, up here, we've got the Clean Futures Act, which was introduced in early March. It was out in the last Congress. I don't believe it's changed significantly. Okay, and I think there was just testimony on that in Energy and Commerce. It's coming out of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and they don't have jurisdiction over a carbon price. So if they, even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be the ones forwarding that. And yet this, unlike the Biden plan, which is really just spending some money and then approaching the electricity sector, the Clean Futures plan is, or act, is really a comprehensive climate policy. They're looking to reduce emissions by 50% or by 100% by 2050, and it's soup to nuts. It's a complete plan. I wanted to show this also because we're going to talk about it over the summer. Last summer, there was a large document coming from the House Select Committee, just the Democrats on it, that really laid out a way to get to net zero by 2050 using almost entirely regulations. They said, yeah, we're open to a carbon tax, but they really laid out a plan where it was regulation only. And the Senate also did something similar. They're both very compelling documents. So, but do note that the regulatory approaches that have been forwarded have had no Republican participation. They were Democrat only in each instance. So I want to show you something from the House Select Committee report, because what it shows is, one, it's a really pretty picture, but what it shows is that you can use regulations to reduce emissions in the US by 88% by 2050. So this is really, I mean, they were kind of saying, look, we can do it. Of note, the modeling here is done by Energy Innovation. You can see it down here in the left-hand corner. And this is the energy policy simulator. And I think at some point, Rick is going to provide a training to folks on using this model. But let's look at this, and let's look at the regulatory policies involved. And I'm only going to highlight 3 because they're reflective of the rest and they do the heavy lifting. I'm going to go to the bottom here, the Clean Energy Standard. Okay, that's going to pertain only to the electric power sector of the economy. That's responsible for 27% of US emissions. And it's basically going to say, we need to move from a mix of clean and dirty electricity to clean only. Okay, so you're going to set a standard by which utility companies have to use an increasing amount of, or proportion of, clean energy in their energy mix until they hit 100% clean energy. Okay, there's a lot more detail behind that. And for reference, probably the best reference that we have on clean energy standards, Tony Cerna wrote something, and it's in Community, called Understanding Clean Energy Standards. Feel free to look that up. It's a great document exploring these. And it's in the Biden plan. It's in the House, not the House, but the Energy and Commerce Clean Futures Plan. So this one's out there a little bit. But again, just a standard, utilities use more and more clean energy, a regulation. I'm going to go here next to the Industrial Performance Standard. This is going to be similar enough, but for the industrial sector of the economy. And that represents 22% of emissions if you don't count the electricity they use, okay? So it's a very important piece. And this is a way to say to industry, okay, you need to increasingly have a lower and lower carbon content of your industrial processes, so that it needs to be less carbon intensive over time. And then finally, here, the red section, this is a ZEV standard. So this is in the transportation sector. That's the biggest one in the US economy. It's 29% of US emissions. And what we're used to seeing to this point is a CAFE standard, which says that automobile companies have to produce more and more fuel efficient engines. This says increasingly car companies need to sell zero emission vehicles, and people need to drive zero emission vehicles. So you look back at this and it sure is a pretty graph, and it's somewhat compelling. You know, it's kind of the kindergarten approach to me. Look at something bad's happening out there. There's carbon pollution and it's very harmful. Well, just tell them to stop. I like to refer to this as sort of the Bob Newhart approach, where you just tell folks, just stop it. If you've not seen that routine, go to YouTube and grab it. It's hilarious. Bob Newhart's a very funny guy. But especially from a moralistic or ethical standpoint, this type of approach, and you know it, you're out there advocating, is very compelling to folks. Market? I don't need no stinking market, right? Just make them stop. They're doing a bad thing, make them stop. So that's at the heart of this approach here. Okay, but now I want to ask you something, and I'll have you put it in chat. See if I can get my chat up and running. Tell me, what's missing from this story? I mean, it looks really compelling, but if you were to pass a comprehensive climate policy, what else would you need here? Go ahead and drop that and go, okay, carbon pricing, absolutely no carbon price. But there's a bit of info. Yeah, look at this, says you can get 88% emissions. So somebody says administrative costs, and I like that. That's certainly part of it. How do we, oops, you guys are oversight costs, etc. Okay, so you're getting close enough. I'm going to go with it. Wait a minute. Is there a cost to doing this? Well, there is. Okay, who's going to pay that cost? And I'm not going to read all the notes. Thank you for contributing to that. Yeah, there's going to be a cost here. Who pays it? You know, all these processes are going to have to change. Electricity rates are going to go up. Who pays it? In EICDA, that is all answered, right? So let's talk about that now. I want to just, I want to contrast these two approaches, because if you haven't talked about what it's going to cost and who's going to pay that cost, you know, it's just not, it's not a complete proposal. In fact, with Biden's plan, he's come out bravely with a way to pay for it. He said, we're going to raise corporate taxes, possibly taxes on income earners over 400 grand, something like that. And the moment you get that, the moment that you distinguish who's going to pay the cost, you're going to get blowback. And Republicans have come out and said, no way, even Joe Manchin has. But anyway, let's compare fundamentally these two approaches. With a carbon price, you're simply providing everybody a financial incentive specifically for what you're after, to reduce carbon pollution. The bad thing is the carbon pollution. We're gonna charge you for emitting carbon, and providing you a financial incentive to do that. Okay, great. So in the literature, the term that you'll hear is flexibility. This provides flexibility because all consumers, producers or firms, and innovators are going to be able to have the flexibility to find the least cost way to reduce emissions. Okay, and as a result, this will be the least cost way to reduce emissions by a certain amount. Regulations are a little different, and I've got the key ones listed up there for you. Here, a body, a governmental agency prescribes, right, how you reduce these emissions. So there's less flexibility. There's a lot less flexibility. Now, there's a third alternative, and this is what is being bandied about. You can use a combination. You can use regulations with market components. So the clean energy standards that we've seen, in fact, have a market component. You can trade clean energy credits. I'll describe that to you in a minute. So you can actually combine market and regulation. But here's the fundamental difference between the two. One, you don't tell people what to do. You just provide a financial incentive to do less of the bad thing. The other one, there is a body from on high that says, you know, you're going to reduce, and here's how you're going to reduce. Okay, now what I want to do with you is suggest 4 reasons why CCL prefers carbon pricing over regulations to do the heavy lifting, okay? A combination is great, but for the bulk of the emission reductions, we say carbon pricing is the way to go. And the number one reason, and I think it's very important, is what we just mentioned. Carbon pricing provides that flexibility. It's going to cost less to reduce. We established in week 2 that our policy is good for the economy. GDP grows in the short term a little bit, in the long term a lot. It's good for the economy. Regulations, we cannot make that argument to the same degree. It's going to cost more. Okay, let me give you examples of why. Let's compare a CAFE standard with the carbon price equivalent, a gas tax. And what the literature says is that it's 3 to 6 times more expensive to reduce a ton of emissions with a CAFE standard than a carbon tax. And to explain this, once again, I'm being cruel tonight. I'm being mean. I want you to go to chat, and I want you to tell me you're living on the planet and you need transportation. Okay. Now, you've got a carbon tax. You're now subject to a carbon tax, and it's a direct tax on carbon emissions. Tell me some of the things that you can do in order to manage your finances and to reduce the effect of the carbon tax on your budget. What are the things you can do in the transportation sector to reduce emissions? Don't drive, take public transit. Okay, it's going to go drive less, bike, yeah, ride bikes, etc. Public transport, walk, bike, transit, so lots of different things, right? EV, you can get a lower cost car, you can drive a smaller car. I love it. Okay, you guys got it. Thank you for participating with me. It's a whole lot more fun when somebody does something other than me. I'm sure you'll agree. That's exactly right. There's a lot of different things. A CAFE standard directs automobile manufacturers to make more fuel efficient cars. That's great. That's just one thing. There's no incentive to take the bus, to take the train, to drive less. That's key. And as a result, you're able to reduce emissions, but at much higher cost through a CAFE standard. But what about a zero emission vehicle standard? And there's no literature that I've seen to this point comparing the two. Well, that's great, right? And we're all in favor of that kind of thing. However, what if people just drive Hummer ZEVs? It's really valuable when the tax is on exactly what you're trying to reduce. Okay, and in this case, it's carbon pollution. You know, if you make huge Hummer type ZEVs, there's a lot of carbon charge involved in that. Okay, so I think you can get that. This is a little bit more interesting and very important. A renewable portfolio standard or a clean electricity standard in the electric sector versus a carbon price. I'm saying 0 to 6. Let's take a look first at the renewable portfolio standard. They're active in 35 states in the US. It's important, and this is just telling them, look, you got to use more clean energy. But that's a little too simple. One of the things you're not distinguishing there is there's no difference between burning coal or burning natural gas for example, but we all know coal is twice as polluting. Okay, so in fact, if you were to have a renewable portfolio standard and coal was cheaper in this particular area, as that proportion of clean energy went up and up, coal would be the last thing to go, right? Because it's the cheapest. You'll hold on to that to the bitter end. What happens with a carbon price? It's a direct charge on carbon emissions. We've seen from the analysis, coal is the first thing to go because it's the most polluting. You get what's going on there? So once again, you're going to reduce emissions in the electric sector at a lot more cheaply, a lot less expensive with a carbon price than a CES. Now, why the zero? Because a clean energy standard can be made to be more efficient, almost as efficient as a carbon price. And here are the two key elements of that. A carbon intensity benchmark is going to take care of the issue distinguishing coal and natural gas and other things. Okay, they're going to set the standard based on not clean energy versus dirty energy, which is just too broad, but on the carbon intensity of the fuel used. Okay, so there, coal's going to get twice the penalty of natural gas. So that's going to be a big deal. Credit trading. So clean energy credit trading. It's like cap and trade. And Tony's article goes into this nicely. What you want is for folks to reduce emissions as cheap as possible. If you've got one utility that can reduce emissions at 20 a ton, and another that can reduce it at 60 a ton, it may be that what happens here is the one that can reduce for 20 a ton more cheaply doesn't just meet its requirement, but keeps on going, keeps reducing emissions, earns additional credits that for clean energy it doesn't need to submit, and they can then sell them, say at $40 for $40 a ton to that utility that it costs $60. So for the utility for which it costs $60, they make money, right? Because they were able to comply with the standard for $40 a ton instead of 60, and the one who can reduce for 20, gets to make that $20 profit as well. What's the point? Now, eventually the clean energy standard is going to increase, and that, they're all going to have to go green. They're all going to have to go clean. But it does allow for emissions to be reduced over time at least cost. That makes it more efficient. My point is, generally, regulations are not as efficient. They cost more than carbon pricing. But a clean energy standard, if done carefully, and the ones that are out there now can be almost as efficient as a carbon price. One of my favorite things to do is my slide. That was all sort of broad conversation, theoretical conversation. Now I want to give you a number on efficiency that you can walk away with. You can talk to people about, you can use in your advocacy. The Climate Leadership Council, okay, who has a very similar policy to ours. It's CF&D, starts at $40 a ton, goes up by 5% a year. They had a study done through NERA, and we're familiar with that model, EMF 32, okay? And what they did was they took their policy and saw the emissions it would reduce over 16 years to 2036. And then they took a reasonably reflective set of regulatory policies that would reduce emissions the same amount. They said, okay, let's compare the impact of GDP on both. And what they found was that by 2036, so this is going to start out low as, emission reductions are low, and then it's going to increase over time, this gap. By 2036, the carbon pricing policy led to a GDP that was 420 billion higher. Okay, and that is it's a number that may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but that's each year. So that translates to $100 per month per household. So that's a little bit more real to people. I think I give you this, it is not peer reviewed. It's done by an advocate, but I think it's representative. Okay, I think that is the approximate, that's a good reflection of how much more expensive it is to reduce emissions significantly through regulation. So that'll be useful for you. Okay, 3 more things and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. Rick showed this last week. Fairness. This is important to us. What Rick showed is here we've got on the y-axis, we've got tax burden. So negative is good. A policy that reduces your tax burden is good. And we're going to look at 4 different revenue neutral carbon tax scenarios. Okay. When the money goes back to deficit reduction, goes back to reduce payroll taxes, reduce corporate income tax, and in the yellow, this is CF&D, the money goes back to per capita household rebates. And I think we've gone over this before, but real quick, CF&D is it. It's the only one that provides a significant financial benefit to the bottom 2 quintiles. And this is not our policy. This was done by Noah Kaufman. It was provided to the Energy and Commerce Committee in that testimony. That's all in the white paper. It's even, the difference is even greater with our policy. It's even a greater benefit to the poor. Regulations are in the same boat as the other revenue neutral carbon taxes. They are flat to slightly regressive. And you'll see an article linked in the paper on this that will give you the sources. It doesn't help the poor. In fact, it's a slight burden on the poor. Unless something is done like Biden is attempting to do, where he says, we're going to spend all this money, generate all these benefits, and 40% of the benefits are going to go to the poorest. So fairness. Fairness is important to us. Climate policy is going to cause some real changes. We want to protect the poor. So that's a second reason why we favor that over regulation. 3 and 4, urgency. What we've seen with regulation in the past is that the regulation needs to be designed, implemented, and enforced. And this takes time. A federal agency will do the designing and the implementation, and sometimes there are court challenges, and sometimes they succeed. So one of the things that we really like about carbon pricing is we're crystal clear. Congress has the authority in the Constitution to tax and to distribute those revenues. We're good. This passes, it begins providing the incentive to reduce emissions immediately. Generally, it takes effect in 9 months, but the incentive's out there immediately. Folks want to start reducing emissions quick. Carbon tax is the way to go. Durability, I'm going to hand this over to Sarah now. Sarah, let's see if I can stop sharing. This is important to us. Why? Carbon taxing is the only way to get broad support. It's the only way to get Republican support. We got at least 3 Republican senators talking about it now. Romney's said he's interested in CFD. Lindsey Graham came out over the weekend, I believe, and said this would be the approach he would consider. Lisa Murkowski has said it's got to be on the table. Carbon pricing's got to be on the table. So if we got, our job's not done yet, but if we got a shot for broad support, something that will stand or will be around through the next election cycle, we're going to need broad support. And that's critical, because then we're going to turn to the rest of the world, to the other 6/7, the other 85% of emissions. And we want to pass a policy that spurs them. They need to know that the US is in it for the long haul. We think a broadly supported policy is the way to do that. Oh, took too long. Now I'm going to stop sharing and let Sarah go ahead.
Yeah, actually, Jerry, would you mind keeping the slides up for me?
Now, say that one more time.
Would you mind keeping the slides up for me?
I will do that.
Thank you.
Is that what we agreed and I just forgot?
It's okay.
What'd I tell you, Rick? Getting to that point where
No worries. But so now we're going to talk about complementary policies, so those regulatory policies that might complement a carbon price. So first of all, just to get us all straight on what we're using as definitions for this, a complement is something that brings something that completes or brings something to perfection, or the number or quantity of something that's required to make a group complete. So you can imagine how this might play out in policy, where a complementary policy to another policy, in this case, we're going to be using, we're going to be talking about complementary policies to a carbon fee and dividend, would be something that addresses something that carbon fee and dividend doesn't cover at all. So carbon fee and dividend covers a lot of the percentage of emissions in the United States, but not all of them, or something that accelerates something that carbon fee and dividend does cover. So there are things that carbon fee and dividend does cover that might not be as responsive to a carbon price as they might be to a specific regulation, or might need a little bit of an extra push. So those would be forms of complementary policies. And the opposite of a complementary policy would be a redundant policy. So a redundant policy is something that covers exactly what carbon fee and dividend is already very effectively covering. And why do we care about complementary policies? Of course, because there is no silver bullet to climate change. We are really confident that carbon fee and dividend is the best backbone or the best first step to addressing climate change, but there are going to be other things that are going to be needed to get us to our ultimate policy goals. So in order to do that, we need to look really closely at the sources of emissions that are covered by carbon fee and dividend, and how they respond to signals like carbon prices in order to understand what areas need support. And on the next slide, the good thing is that there are really smart people out there who are looking at things like this. So Jerry, on the next slide there, you can see that there are policy researchers out there who are looking at what policies are complementary to carbon prices and what policies are redundant. So this gives a little bit of a roadmap for how to think about this. And we'll go into more detail, but just really quickly looking at this spectrum, you can see there are policies that are really redundant with carbon pricing. So things like regulations of greenhouse gas emissions that are covered by the carbon tax itself. Then you are just double regulating something. But on the really complementary side, you'd have regulations of greenhouse gases that are not covered by the carbon tax. Those are things that still need to be addressed, or things like regulations of local air pollutants turn out to be really complementary. And of course, in the middle, there are things that are somewhat complementary, somewhat redundant, things like subsidies for low carbon technologies, or renewable or low carbon fuel standards, where a carbon price somewhat addresses them, but might not be the best or most efficient or strongest way to address them. And on the next slide, we'll talk about a couple of specific examples and just talk through how each of these react to a carbon price, how each of these do or don't react to a carbon price, and why these might be examples of big areas of complementary policies. And I'll drop the links to the papers that discuss these a little bit more. But again, these are all big areas that there might be complementary policies within, according to all these other researchers. So for example, in energy efficiency, carbon prices theoretically affect individual choices by increasing all of the costs of carbon intensive products and activities. And these increasing costs would cause an individual with all of the information at hand making purely economic decisions to choose more energy efficient options. But of course, in reality, we are all a little bit more complex than just a completely rational economic actor like we like to think about in the literature. So, and in reality, there are barriers to this information and these resources. And these factors, all these factors besides just the economics, sway our decisions. So in reality, though a carbon price in theory works really well for energy efficiency, in reality, there will be some other barriers. So there could be other policies to address energy efficiency and to incentivize energy efficiency that might make that move a little bit faster. In transportation, this is an area where sometimes we think that a carbon price signal might not work as well as it will in other industries. We, as economists say, use the term inelastic to describe this, which means that it's just not as responsive to the carbon price and the behavior won't change as much. And that's due to a couple of different reasons. There are things like barriers to public transportation. Outside of cities, public transportation just does not work as well. Also, there are muddier price signals for cars because we've all seen gas prices fluctuate more than $1 a gallon or so here and there. So when we see the price change on gasoline due to a carbon price, it won't be as clear to everyday consumers why that price is going up. And last but not least, some things just can't change with transportation. We all still need to go to work. We all still need to see our family and friends. These are things that we won't be able to stop doing if they become more expensive. So there could be things like, and also electric vehicles are still considerably more expensive than internal combustion engines. So there could be things like fuel economy standards or electric vehicle sales mandates or infrastructure investment that could all help increase the decarbonization of transportation. In coal retirements, we all know that coal has negative health impacts on communities, and a carbon price does send a really strong economic incentive to disincentivize the use of coal power. But what it does not do is guarantee the retirement of coal-fired power plants, which is something that's really important for communities that live near coal-fired power plants. So the guaranteed retirement of those coal-fired power plants is beneficial. On the industry side, some of our highest emitters that we're talking about are things like cement, glass, iron, steel, paper. And these industries all face barriers that prevent them from reducing their emissions, even when faced with a carbon price. For example, there might be lack of low carbon alternatives for them to use in their industry practices until innovation has time to kick in and give them better low carbon alternatives. And also, even when there are better low carbon alternatives, there are going to be really high upfront capital costs that they'll have to invest in before they can get their factories using those low carbon alternatives. So in the short term, there will be carbon capture and sequestration needed for some of these industries while cleaner alternatives develop and while they are implemented. So things like maybe credits for sequestered carbon or safety nets for new projects or government investments in carbon capture and sequestration infrastructure could all help increase the captured emissions from industry. In low carbon technology development, carbon prices do create incentives for us to move to low carbon energy, but they don't address the specific barriers to their deployment. So by addressing the specific barriers to their deployment, we could make this happen faster and therefore reduce our emissions faster. It takes time to build and invest in infrastructure and move away from fossil fuels after that price signal is set by a carbon price, where carbon intensive products will get more expensive, and policies that directly support these transitions can make the process of decarbonization smoother. And the last one that we'll talk about today is making greener buildings. So buildings require a lot of upfront costs, and things that get built now might need more incentive to take into account what things will look like in the future. Again, because of those barriers to information, or just because they're operating now and not thinking as far ahead. So requiring buildings to use electricity instead of natural gas, or providing incentives for property owners to electrify can contribute to faster emissions reductions than just a carbon price alone. Yes, so those are all different areas of complementary policies, but we can get a little bit more numerical with all of this. So on the next slide, there's a really good graph that I want to walk through in some detail that breaks down how complementary all of these policies might be. And going one more ahead to Jerry, we'll just zoom in on this because I know that that's too small for anyone to read.
Okay.
Just to establish what we're talking about here, there's a high carbon tax scenario and a low carbon tax scenario. In this paper, the low tax scenario starts with a $30 per ton price on carbon in 2021 and rises at 5% plus inflation per year, which makes it reach $44 by 2030. And then, I'm sorry, that was the low carbon tax scenario. And then the high carbon tax scenario starts at $15 per ton and rises by $15 per year, reaching $150 by 2030. So neither of these are exactly what the Energy Innovation Act models and Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act models, but the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act is more similar to the high carbon price scenario as we're talking through these charts. But you'll see that in this first section here, it's showing that in the high tax scenario that emissions are responsive to the high tax scenario. By 2030 and in 2025, under the high tax scenario, our emissions are reduced more under the high tax scenario than the low tax scenario, and in both, they're reduced under our current level of emissions. So it's just showing that it's working. When you go down, it kind of breaks this down by sector. and shows us how much each of these carbon tax scenarios are pulling their weight in each of these individual sectors, and how effective any of these different kinds of complementary policies might be if they were implemented alongside either the low or the high carbon tax. So looking in this electricity sector chunk, we'll first look at what this is saying is that if you were to add a policy limiting natural gas build out in the low tax scenario, that would be a really effective way to increase your reduction of emissions. In the high tax scenario, it's saying that the high tax has already taken care of most of this natural gas build out, meaning that that sector is pretty responsive to this carbon price. And there aren't many more emissions to be reduced by implementing a limit on natural gas build out in the electricity sector in 2030. If you look at additional coal retirements, it is showing that it's pretty responsive to the carbon price as well, and that the high tax is forcing more coal retirements than the low tax, but in both scenarios, there is a lot of room to reduce emissions. Additionally, by adding a complementary policy, which would reduce additional force additional coal retirements. Looking at CCS, it gets kind of interesting. Carbon capture and sequestration retrofits, under the high tax scenario, it says 0. That's meaning that there would be no more emissions reductions if you added that under the high tax scenario, meaning that the high tax scenario already incentivized all of those CCS retrofits that would be needed, but under the low tax scenario, it would be more helpful. And under both, it's saying that avoiding nuclear retirements is something that the carbon price on its own is saying that would be pretty redundant to also in 2030 add a policy to avoid nuclear retirements, because this is something that the carbon price is already doing on its own. Jerry, do you have anything to add to that so far?
No, I thought you did great.
Thanks.
I thought that was...
And then there are 2 more sections of this. If you go to the next slide where we zoom in on that, we have in the transportation sector, you'll already see that all these bars are really close together. And just a reminder, since we broke it up, the dark blue is the high carbon tax and the light blue is low carbon tax. So it is showing that all of these kinds of policy, that the transportation sector is responsive to a carbon price, but it doesn't move very quickly to a carbon price. This is what the inelasticity that we're talking about, where when you put the high carbon price in, it does reduce emissions a little bit more, but there's still a lot of room to be gained by complementary policies being enacted in these areas. So things like improved fuel economy of electric vehicles or electrification of more vehicles, or additional low carbon fuels, investments in those might be good areas for complementary policies. And similarly in the building sector, it's showing that electrification of appliances, interestingly, in the high carbon tax scenario, it's showing that would actually be more beneficial, probably because we're using more electricity, and improved energy efficiency. There's a lot of variation, but there's also a lot of room for improvement in both of those. And in the industrial sector, it's showing that industrial carbon capture and sequestration, like we were talking about before, it's pretty responsive, the carbon capture and sequestration to the carbon price. It provides a really strong incentive, but under the low tax scenario, there is still a little bit of room. And I'll turn it back over to you, Jerry.
Okay. Well, that's the lecture. I just want to summarize. So the summary points for tonight. Look, at regulations clearly have a very valuable role to play, especially if they're complementary, if they're redundant like a CAFE standard. The job really can get done and more efficiently by a carbon tax. But there are plenty of really good policies, and we're beginning to see some of them forwarded. A lot of the infrastructure plan from Biden is this low carbon R&D spending, infrastructure for the grid, infrastructure spending for electric vehicles. It'll be really valuable. It's a good thing, and it's beginning to happen, and that's great. So regulations can help. We absolutely welcome them. I don't know if I said this before. In looking at the regulatory policies, I did say this, yeah. We have very much the same objectives as the folks that are forwarding these. So I comment on regulatory policies as with complete respect and appreciation for the folks that are forwarding them. And What we're doing here is, first and foremost, we're advocating for strong climate policy that protects the poor. And we've got a tool, CF&D. And it just happens to be that that tool is great policy. So your advocacy, the tool that you're using, happens to be really just, it's the best policy that we can think of. Congress is going to make sausage. We don't know what it's going to look like at this point. Hopefully we'll know more in about 6 months. And we'll either back it or we won't. It's, above my pay grade. I don't know what's going to happen there, but you should feel very good about your advocacy. So I just want to take literally 2 minutes to summarize the course and what we've seen and really underline the point that I just made. EICDA and CF&D generally, we've seen that this policy reduces emissions to net zero by 2050. All the costs are embedded. It's a complete policy. We've got legislative language. We have a plan to get to net zero by 2050. You should feel very good about that. GDP, it's positive to GDP, a little bit in the short term, but very positive in the long term, in which if we do not address climate change, it will reduce GDP by the end of the century by at least 25%, according to the IMF. That's a big deal. We need to get going on this now for the sake of the economy. If you hear, but it'll wreck the economy, which is something that former President Trump said, that's quite the opposite. If we don't do something about climate, it will wreck the economy. Net benefits. Now we're looking at benefits a little bit more broadly to include the things that society and humanity are interested in, like the value of a human life. We found that our policy, or EICDA, saved 90,000 lives a year between now and 2050, 70,000 hospitalizations, 6 million workdays a year. The loss of those is prevented by a policy like ours simply by cleaning up the air. Tremendous climate benefits as well. They're worth $1 trillion a year on a net basis. Job opportunities will grow, especially in the electric sector. We will benefit the poor financially, and I think we feel real good about that. And then what we showed tonight, there's just real clear advantages to a carbon price over a regulatory approach. So again, you're advocating for fabulous policy. I hope you feel good about that, and hold your head up high when you're out there advocating.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Jared.
everyone.
Thank you.
We'll have to do it again
Thanks very
sometime.
much. It was excellent.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.